Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we step into one of the most dramatic and mysterious moments in ancient history, the shocking assassination of Julius Caesar, a man who rose from political ambition to become one of the most powerful figures the world had ever seen. This is the beginning of our series, The Mystery Behind the Assassination of Julius Caesar, where we will explore not only the brutal moment of his death but also the secrets, fears, betrayals, and political tensions that slowly built the path toward that unforgettable day in ancient Rome. For many people, Caesar's death is remembered simply as a famous betrayal, a dramatic scene where a powerful leader was surrounded and stabbed by men he once trusted. But the real story is far deeper, darker, and far more complex than that. Behind those knives were years of political rivalry, fear of dictatorship, personal grudges, and the desperate struggle to protect a fragile republic that many believed Caesar was about to destroy. Long before the daggers were drawn, the Roman world had already been trembling under the weight of power struggles, civil wars, and ambitious generals fighting for dominance. Caesar himself had already shocked Rome by crossing the Rubicon, an act that ignited a civil war and forever changed the balance of power in the Republic. After defeating his rival Pompey and consolidating control, Caesar returned to Rome not just as a victorious general but as a leader with unprecedented authority. Soon he was declared dictator, and eventually dictator for life. To some citizens, he was a hero who brought stability after years of chaos. But to others, especially the traditional Roman elites, this was a terrifying signal that the Republic was dying and a monarchy was quietly being reborn. Among those who feared Caesar's growing power were influential senators like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, men who would later become central figures in one of the most infamous conspiracies in history. Yet the question that historians have debated for centuries remains the same: was Caesar truly planning to become a king, or were his enemies driven by paranoia and political jealousy? The tension inside Rome's Senate grew stronger with every honor Caesar received. Statues were raised in his name, festivals celebrated his victories, and rumors began to spread that he might soon accept a royal crown. For a society that had violently rejected kings centuries earlier, the very idea of monarchy was dangerous and deeply emotional. In the shadows of this political storm, a secret group of senators began to gather, convinced that removing Caesar was the only way to save the Republic. But conspiracies are rarely simple. Personal ambitions, rivalries, and hidden motives mixed with political ideology, turning the plot into a complicated web of loyalty and betrayal. Some conspirators claimed they acted for freedom and the future of Rome. Others may have been motivated by wounded pride after Caesar's rise pushed them into the background of power. As we move deeper into this series, we will explore the hidden meetings, the coded conversations, and the secret planning that took place before the assassination. We will examine the mysterious warnings Caesar reportedly received, the strange omens that ancient writers described, and the famous prophecy that warned him to beware the Ides of March. Was Caesar truly blind to the danger around him, or did he simply believe that no one would dare strike him inside the very heart of Roman political power? On the morning of the fateful day, during the legendary Ides of March in 44 BCE, Caesar walked toward the Senate meeting unaware that more than 60 men had already agreed to participate in a violent act that would change the course of world history. The Senate chamber was meant to be a place of debate and governance, yet it would soon become the stage for one of the most shocking political murders ever recorded. Within minutes, the most powerful man in Rome would fall under a storm of blades, leaving behind not only a body but also a legacy of unanswered questions. Did the conspirators truly save the Republic, or did they accidentally destroy it? Was Caesar a tyrant in the making, or a visionary leader whose death pushed Rome into even greater chaos? And perhaps the most haunting question of all: why did men who once respected and even admired Caesar ultimately decide that he had to die? Throughout this series, we will uncover the truth hidden behind the legend, separating myth from historical reality as we revisit one of the greatest political assassinations ever recorded. The story of Julius Caesar's death is not just about betrayal, it is about power, fear, loyalty, and the fragile balance between ambition and freedom in the ancient world. So if you love mysterious history, political intrigue, and dramatic true stories from the past, stay with me as we begin our journey into the shadowy conspiracy that ended the life of Julius Caesar and changed the destiny of Rome forever. The story of the assassination of Julius Caesar did not begin on the day he was killed. Its roots stretched many years back into the chaotic political world of the Roman Republic, where ambition, fear, and power constantly collided. In the 1st century BCE, the ancient city of Rome was already struggling under the weight of internal conflicts. The republic that had once been guided by a careful balance of laws and senatorial authority was slowly being reshaped by powerful generals who commanded loyal armies. Among these ambitious figures, Caesar stood out for his intelligence, charisma, and relentless determination. Born into a respected but not particularly wealthy Roman family, Caesar rose through the political ranks with remarkable speed. He was not only a skilled politician but also an extraordinary military commander. His campaigns in Gaul transformed him into one of the most famous generals of his time. Through years of brutal warfare, he expanded Roman territory and gained enormous popularity among his soldiers and the Roman public. His victories made him wealthy and powerful, but they also made many politicians in Rome deeply nervous. One of the most powerful men who feared Caesar's growing influence was the Roman general Pompey. At one time, Pompey and Caesar had been allies, working together in a political alliance known as the First Triumvirate alongside the wealthy politician Marcus Licinius Crassus. For several years, this alliance dominated Roman politics, but it was fragile from the beginning. When Crassus died during a disastrous campaign in the east, the balance between Pompey and Caesar collapsed. Soon their rivalry turned into open hostility. Many members of the Roman Senate began to support Pompey because they feared Caesar was becoming too powerful. They believed he might use his army to take control of the republic itself. Tension reached a breaking point in 49 BCE when the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. For Caesar, obeying this order would mean losing his power and possibly facing prosecution by his enemies. Instead, he made one of the most dramatic decisions in Roman history. With his loyal soldiers beside him, Caesar crossed the small but symbolic river known as the Rubicon. By doing this, he effectively declared war on the Roman Republic. According to later historical accounts, he famously declared that the die is cast, meaning there was no turning back. The moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Rome was thrown into a brutal civil war. Pompey and many senators fled the city, gathering their forces in the eastern provinces. Caesar moved quickly, capturing territory and pursuing his enemies across the Mediterranean world. The conflict eventually reached its decisive moment in 48 BCE at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar's experienced army defeated Pompey's forces. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to find refuge there, but he was betrayed and murdered shortly after arriving. With his greatest rival gone, Caesar emerged as the undisputed master of the Roman world. When he returned to Rome, the Senate granted him extraordinary honors. He was appointed dictator multiple times, and eventually he was named dictator for life. To his supporters, Caesar was the man who had restored order after years of political chaos and civil war. He introduced reforms, reorganized the calendar, reduced corruption, and attempted to stabilize the Roman government. However, not everyone saw him as a savior. Many senators believed the republic was being destroyed before their eyes. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on rejecting kings and ruling through a system of elected officials and shared authority. Caesar's growing power seemed dangerously close to monarchy. Statues of him were erected across Rome, temples honored him, and rumors began to spread that he might soon accept the title of king. These developments alarmed many members of the Senate, who feared that the ancient traditions of the Republic were disappearing. Among those who watched Caesar's rise with increasing concern were two men who would later become central figures in the conspiracy against him, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Both men came from respected Roman families and believed deeply in the ideals of the Republic. Yet their motivations were complicated. Some historians believe they genuinely feared Caesar was becoming a tyrant. Others argue that personal jealousy and political ambition also played important roles in their decisions. As Caesar continued to accumulate honors and authority, whispers of resistance began to circulate among the senators. Private conversations turned into secret meetings, and secret meetings slowly evolved into something far more dangerous. A group of powerful Roman politicians started to consider a shocking possibility: removing Caesar permanently. But assassinating the most powerful man in Rome would not be easy. Caesar was loved by many citizens and protected by loyal supporters. Any attempt on his life would need to be carefully planned and supported by multiple conspirators. The seeds of betrayal were being planted quietly inside the very heart of Roman politics. No one yet knew how far this conspiracy would grow or how dramatically it would change the course of history. In the shadows of Rome's grand temples and marble halls, a storm was beginning to form, one that would soon explode on a day forever remembered as the Ides of March. After the Civil War ended and Julius Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed leader of the Roman world, the political atmosphere of the Republic began to change rapidly. Caesar was no longer just a victorious general, he had become the center of Roman power itself. The Senate, once the heart of Roman political authority, now seemed to revolve around him. Many senators publicly praised him and supported his reforms, but beneath the surface, uneasiness was growing. Caesar's rise had been so swift and so overwhelming that many traditional Roman elites began to fear that the ancient republic was slowly disappearing. For centuries, Rome had been built on the idea that no single man should hold absolute power. The Romans had overthrown their last king nearly 500 years earlier, and ever since then, the word king carried a sense of danger and oppression. Yet Caesar's growing authority made many people wonder whether Rome was drifting back toward the very system it once rejected. Caesar continued to accumulate honors that seemed almost royal in nature. Statues of him were placed among those of ancient gods, his image appeared on coins, and he was granted the title of dictator for life. Some officials even proposed that he should be allowed to wear royal clothing and sit on a golden throne during public ceremonies. These gestures, though meant to honor him, alarmed many senators who believed that such symbols were slowly transforming Caesar into a monarch. At the same time, Caesar was implementing reforms that strengthened his control over the government. He expanded the Senate by adding many of his own supporters, which diluted the influence of traditional aristocratic families. He also reorganized the Roman calendar, introduced new laws to reduce corruption, and attempted to stabilize the provinces that had suffered from years of war and mismanagement. To many ordinary citizens, these reforms seemed practical and beneficial. Caesar was seen as a leader who could bring order to a republic that had been torn apart by endless political conflicts. However, for many senators, these actions looked like calculated moves designed to weaken their authority and concentrate power in Caesar's hands. Among those who watched these developments with growing concern were two men who would soon become the leaders of a secret resistance, Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius was an experienced military commander and a skilled politician who had fought against Caesar during the Civil War but had later been pardoned. Although Caesar had forgiven him, Cassius never fully accepted Caesar's dominance. He believed that Rome was losing its freedom and that Caesar's power threatened the very foundations of the Republic. Brutus, on the other hand, was a more complicated figure. Known for his intelligence and philosophical thinking, Brutus had once been close to Caesar and had even benefited from his generosity. Yet Brutus also came from a family with a powerful historical legacy. His ancestor, also named Brutus, had famously helped overthrow the last king of Rome centuries earlier and establish the Roman Republic. Because of this legacy, many people believed Brutus had a special duty to defend the Republic against tyranny. Cassius understood that if a conspiracy against Caesar was ever going to succeed, it would need someone with Brutus's reputation and moral authority. Quietly and carefully, Cassius began to approach him, planting seeds of doubt about Caesar's intentions. At first, Brutus hesitated. He respected Caesar and was not easily convinced that assassination was justified. But the political climate in Rome was becoming increasingly tense. Rumors began spreading that Caesar might soon accept the title of king during an upcoming ceremony. During one public festival, Caesar was even offered a crown by his ally Mark Antony. Although Caesar refused it, the event made many Romans suspicious. Some believed the entire scene had been carefully staged to test how the public would react to the idea of monarchy. These suspicions fueled the fears of Caesar's opponents and strengthened the arguments of those who believed he must be stopped before it was too late. As weeks passed, Cassius and his allies began quietly gathering support among senators who shared their concerns. Secret conversations took place in private homes and dark corners of Rome's political buildings. Each conspirator faced a dangerous choice: remain loyal to the most powerful man in Rome, or risk everything to defend what they believed was the Republic's freedom. Gradually, more and more senators joined the secret plot. Some were motivated by political ideals, others by jealousy, personal grudges, or fear of losing their influence. The conspiracy grew larger and more dangerous with every passing day. Yet despite their growing numbers, the conspirators understood that success depended on careful planning and absolute secrecy. Caesar was not only powerful but also widely admired by soldiers and citizens alike. If their plan failed, they would almost certainly be executed as traitors. Still, the conspirators believed that the future of Rome depended on their actions. They began to discuss the most shocking possibility imaginable: killing Caesar in the very place where Roman leaders gathered to govern the Republic. The location they considered was the Senate meeting hall, a place where Caesar would feel secure and surrounded by political colleagues rather than armed enemies. The idea was both bold and terrifying. As the plot slowly took shape, the conspirators prepared themselves for a moment that would soon shake the entire Roman world. The day they chose would become one of the most famous dates in history: the legendary Ides of March. As the conspiracy against Julius Caesar quietly expanded within the political heart of Rome, the tension among the Roman elite grew stronger with every passing day. What had started as private concerns among a few senators was now becoming a carefully organized plot involving dozens of powerful men. At the center of this secret movement stood two key figures: Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius was the more aggressive of the two, deeply resentful of Caesar's growing authority and determined to remove him before the Republic disappeared completely. Brutus, however, was far more cautious and conflicted. Many conspirators believed that Brutus's involvement was essential because his reputation as a defender of Roman liberty would make their actions appear honorable rather than treacherous. Without him, the assassination might look like nothing more than a jealous power grab by political rivals. Cassius understood this perfectly and spent weeks carefully persuading Brutus that Caesar's ambition posed a real threat to the future of Rome. According to ancient historians, anonymous letters even began appearing at Brutus's home, supposedly written by concerned citizens who urged him to act in defense of the Republic. Whether these letters were genuine or secretly arranged by Cassius remains one of the small mysteries surrounding the conspiracy. Gradually, Brutus began to accept the argument that extraordinary action might be necessary to save Rome from tyranny. Once he agreed to join the plot, the conspiracy gained both legitimacy and momentum. Soon nearly 60 senators were secretly involved in the plan. Among them were men who had once fought alongside Caesar, others who had previously opposed him in the Civil War, and several ambitious politicians who feared losing their influence under Caesar's expanding power. Despite their differences, they all shared one crucial belief: that Caesar must die before he could transform the Roman Republic into a monarchy. However, planning the assassination of the most powerful man in the Roman world was incredibly dangerous. Caesar moved through Rome surrounded by supporters and political allies, and although he rarely relied heavily on bodyguards, attacking him in public would almost certainly fail. The conspirators debated many possible locations and methods. Some suggested killing him while he traveled through the streets, while others proposed striking during a public ceremony. But each plan carried enormous risks. Eventually, they settled on a location that seemed both symbolic and practical: the Senate meeting itself. During Senate gatherings, Caesar would be seated among fellow politicians rather than soldiers. The conspirators believed that if they attacked together, they could overwhelm him before anyone had time to react. The chosen location was the meeting hall connected to the Theater of Pompey, where the Senate was temporarily gathering while its main building was being repaired. The irony of this location was striking, as the theater complex had been built by Caesar's former rival Pompey, the very man Caesar had defeated during the civil war years earlier. In the days leading up to the assassination, the conspirators carefully refined their plan. They agreed that each man would carry a concealed dagger and participate in the attack so that responsibility would be shared equally. No single assassin would bear the blame alone. This was important because they wanted the act to appear as a collective defense of the Republic rather than a personal murder. Still, even with their careful planning, many conspirators felt nervous. Killing Caesar would not simply remove a leader, it would send shockwaves through the entire Roman world. Caesar was beloved by many citizens and respected by the army. If the public saw the conspirators as traitors, they could face violent retaliation. Despite these fears, the conspirators convinced themselves that their actions would ultimately be celebrated as a heroic defense of Roman liberty. Meanwhile, Caesar himself seemed largely unaware of the growing danger around him. Although rumors occasionally reached him about dissatisfaction among some senators, he had grown confident in his authority and believed that most political opposition had already been defeated during the Civil War. Some of his supporters even warned him to be cautious, suggesting that enemies might still exist within the Senate. Yet Caesar was known for his bold personality and his belief that fear should never control a leader's decisions. According to later historical accounts, several strange warnings appeared in the days before his death. A soothsayer reportedly advised him to beware the Ides of March, a phrase that would later become legendary in historical storytelling. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, is also said to have experienced troubling dreams in which she saw her husband surrounded by blood and violence. Alarmed by these visions, she reportedly begged Caesar to avoid the Senate meeting on that day. But political duty and personal pride made it difficult for Caesar to stay away from such an important gathering. At the same time, the conspirators were finalizing every detail of their plan. They agreed that the attack would take place on the day of the Senate session during the famous Ides of March in 44 BCE. On that morning, Caesar would walk into the Senate chamber expecting an ordinary political meeting, unaware that dozens of men around him had already prepared their daggers. The stage for one of the most dramatic assassinations in history was now fully set, and the fate of Rome was about to change forever. The morning of the famous Ides of March in 44 BCE began like any other day in the busy political world of Rome, yet beneath the calm surface of the city, tension and fear quietly surrounded the final hours of Julius Caesar. The conspirators had already made their decision, and there was no turning back. Nearly 60 senators had secretly agreed to participate in the assassination, each one carrying a hidden dagger and preparing themselves for the moment that would determine the future of the Roman Republic. Their plan was simple but extremely dangerous. They would surround Caesar during the Senate meeting and strike together so quickly that he would have no chance to escape. Yet while the conspirators waited for the Senate session to begin, Caesar himself was still at home, unaware that his life was hanging by a fragile thread. According to several ancient historians, strange warnings had begun to appear during the days leading up to that morning. One of the most famous warnings came from a mysterious soothsayer who had earlier told Caesar to beware the Ides of March. The phrase had puzzled many people, including Caesar himself, but he had chosen not to take it seriously. More troubling, however, were the dreams of his wife, Calpurnia. During the night before the Senate meeting, she reportedly experienced terrifying visions in which she saw her husband surrounded by blood and violence. In her dream, statues of Caesar were said to be flowing with blood while Roman citizens washed their hands in it. When she awoke, deeply frightened, she begged Caesar not to leave the house that day. Calpurnia pleaded with him to cancel the Senate meeting and stay safe at home until the strange omens passed. For a moment, Caesar actually seemed willing to listen to her concerns. Despite his reputation for courage and confidence, He was also a man who respected certain Roman traditions about omens and divine warnings. As the morning progressed, he briefly considered sending a message to postpone the Senate gathering. If this decision had remained unchanged, history might have unfolded very differently. But fate intervened through the arrival of one of the conspirators, a Roman politician named Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus. Decimus was a trusted supporter of Caesar and had fought loyally for him during the civil war. Because of this trust, Caesar had no reason to suspect that Decimus was secretly part of the assassination plot. When Decimus heard that Caesar was thinking about staying home, he quickly went to visit him and persuaded him to change his mind. Decimus argued that canceling the Senate meeting because of a dream would make Caesar appear weak in the eyes of the Roman elite. He also warned that the senators who had gathered for the session might interpret Caesar's absence as an insult. These arguments appealed strongly to Caesar's sense of pride and political responsibility. Eventually, Caesar decided that it would be better to attend the meeting rather than risk looking fearful or disrespectful toward the Senate. With that decision made, the path toward tragedy was sealed. As Caesar prepared to leave his home, he was joined by several friends and political supporters who would accompany him through the streets of Rome. Among them was his loyal ally Mark Antony, one of the most powerful and influential figures in Caesar's inner circle. Unknown to Antony, the conspirators had already planned a way to prevent him from interfering with the assassination. They knew that Antony was strong, loyal, and potentially dangerous if he discovered their intentions. Therefore, one of the conspirators would later distract him outside the Senate building while the attack took place inside. As Caesar made his way through the crowded streets of Rome, he reportedly encountered the same soothsayer who had warned him earlier. According to a famous historical account, Caesar jokingly said to the man that the Ides of March had arrived and nothing bad had happened. The soothsayer calmly replied that the day had indeed come, but it had not yet passed. Whether this conversation truly occurred or was later added by historians remains uncertain, but the story has become one of the most chilling moments associated with Caesar's final journey. When Caesar finally arrived at the Senate meeting place near the Theater of Pompey, the conspirators were already waiting inside. Their hearts were racing, and many of them struggled to hide their nervousness. Each man knew that once the attack began, there would be no escape from the consequences of their actions. Some believed they were about to save the Republic from tyranny, while others simply hoped the plan would succeed before anyone could stop them. Outside the building, one of the conspirators successfully distracted Mark Antony, leading him away from the chamber so that he would not be present during the attack. Inside the Senate hall, the conspirators quietly gathered around Caesar as he took his seat. The room appeared calm and ordinary, yet within moments it would become the scene of one of the most famous political assassinations in history. The men who surrounded Caesar were not enemies from distant battlefields but fellow senators, men he had worked with and trusted. As the meeting began, one conspirator approached Caesar with a petition, pretending to ask for a political favor. It was the signal the others had been waiting for. In just a few seconds, the silence of the Senate chamber would be shattered by violence, and the fate of Julius Caesar, and the future of Rome, would change forever. Inside the Senate chamber near the Theater of Pompey, the atmosphere seemed calm, but beneath that calm surface a deadly plan was about to unfold. Julius Caesar had taken his seat among the senators, unaware that many of the men standing around him had secretly agreed to take part in his assassination. Outside the building, one of the conspirators had successfully distracted Mark Antony, ensuring that Caesar's most loyal ally would not be present during the attack. This was a critical part of the conspirators' plan, because Antony was known for his strength, courage, and loyalty, and if he had been inside the chamber when the attack began, he might have tried to defend Caesar or rally others to stop the plot. Inside the hall, the conspirators slowly moved closer to Caesar, pretending to discuss political matters while carefully positioning themselves around his chair. At the center of this carefully staged moment stood one of the conspirators named Lucius Tullius Cimber, who approached Caesar with what appeared to be a humble request. Cimber presented a petition asking Caesar to pardon his exiled brother and allow him to return to Rome. This request was not unusual. Roman politicians often approached powerful leaders with such petitions. Caesar, however, calmly refused the request, explaining that decisions about exile could not be changed so easily. At that moment, Cimber suddenly grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulders. This shocking action was the signal that the conspirators had been waiting for. Within seconds, another conspirator, Publius Servilius Casca, stepped forward and struck the first blow with a dagger. The attack was not immediately fatal, and Caesar reportedly turned toward Casca in surprise, trying to defend himself. According to some ancient accounts, Caesar even shouted for help as the chaos erupted around him. But the conspirators had already surrounded him completely. One after another, they began to stab him, each man striking with his concealed blade. The Senate chamber, which moments earlier had been a place of political discussion, suddenly became a scene of panic and violence. Some senators who were not part of the conspiracy fled the room in terror, unsure of what was happening. Others watched in shock as the most powerful man in Rome struggled to escape the storm of blades. As the attack continued, Caesar attempted to resist and protect himself, but he was greatly outnumbered. The conspirators believed that every one of them had to participate in the attack so that responsibility would be shared equally. In total, Caesar was stabbed more than 20 times during the assault. However, historians later noted that only one of the wounds was actually fatal. One of the most famous and controversial moments of the assassination occurred when Caesar reportedly saw Marcus Junius Brutus among the attackers. Brutus had once been a trusted friend and ally, and Caesar had shown him great kindness in the past. According to a popular story recorded by later writers, Caesar looked at Brutus in disbelief and spoke the legendary words "Et tu, Brute," meaning "You too, Brutus." Although historians continue to debate whether Caesar actually said these words, the story has become one of the most famous symbols of betrayal in world history. Seeing Brutus among the conspirators may have broken Caesar's final resistance. Some accounts claim that after recognizing Brutus, Caesar stopped fighting and pulled his toga over his face, accepting his fate. Moments later, he collapsed at the base of a statue of Pompey, the former rival he had defeated during the Civil War years earlier. The image of Caesar dying beneath Pompey's statue later became one of the most dramatic and symbolic details of the entire event, as if the ghosts of past rivalries had returned to witness the final act of tragedy. When the attack was over, the conspirators stepped back, their daggers covered in blood. The body of Julius Caesar lay lifeless on the floor of the Senate chamber, and the silence that followed was almost as shocking as the violence itself. The men who had just carried out the assassination believed they had performed a heroic act that would restore freedom to the Roman Republic. Some of them even shouted that Rome was now free from tyranny. Yet the reality outside the chamber was far more uncertain. News of the assassination quickly spread through the city, and the reaction of the Roman people was not what the conspirators had expected. Instead of celebrating the death of Caesar, many citizens were confused, frightened, and angry. Caesar had been popular with the public, and his sudden death created a dangerous political vacuum. Meanwhile, Mark Antony soon learned what had happened and realized that the situation could plunge Rome into chaos once again. The conspirators had succeeded in killing the most powerful man in the Roman world, but they had not prepared for what would come next. The death of Julius Caesar did not restore peace to Rome. Instead, it opened the door to a new wave of political conflict, revenge, and civil war that would ultimately transform the Roman Republic forever. The assassination of Julius Caesar inside the Senate chamber near the theater of Pompey created immediate shock and confusion throughout Rome. For a few moments after the attack, the Senate hall stood in stunned silence as the conspirators looked at the lifeless body of the man who had ruled the Roman world only minutes earlier. Blood stained the marble floor, and Caesar's toga was soaked in red, a chilling reminder of how quickly power could collapse in the dangerous world of Roman politics. The conspirators, led by figures such as Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, believed they had just saved the Roman Republic from tyranny. They had convinced themselves that killing Caesar would restore the balance of power and bring freedom back to Rome. In their minds, They were not murderers but defenders of liberty. Some of them even raised their daggers in the air and shouted that the Republic had been saved. However, the reaction of the people outside the Senate building was far different from what they expected. As terrified senators and witnesses ran through the streets spreading news of the assassination, panic quickly began to spread throughout the city. Many citizens had admired Caesar for his military victories and the reforms he had introduced after years of civil war. Instead of celebrating his death, large numbers of Romans were shocked and frightened by the sudden violence. Shops closed, crowds gathered in confusion, and rumors spread rapidly through the streets. Some people feared that another civil war might soon begin. Inside the Senate chamber, the conspirators realized that they could not remain there safely for long. They left the building together, still carrying their blood-stained daggers, and marched through the streets toward the Capitoline Hill. Their hope was that by appearing together in public they could present themselves as heroes who had liberated Rome from a potential dictator. They believed the citizens would support their actions once they understood that Caesar had been killed to protect the Republic. But the reaction they received was cautious and uncertain. The Roman people did not immediately welcome them as saviors. Instead, many citizens watched silently from a distance, unsure of what would happen next. Meanwhile, one of the most important figures in the unfolding drama had managed to escape the immediate danger. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally and political partner, had been deliberately kept away from the Senate chamber during the assassination. When he learned that Caesar had been murdered, Antony quickly understood that the situation was extremely dangerous. At first he feared that the conspirators might try to eliminate him as well, since he was one of Caesar's closest supporters. For this reason, Antony temporarily fled the city disguised as a servant to avoid being recognized. However, Antony was also a clever and ambitious politician. After the initial shock passed, he realized that Caesar's death might give him an opportunity to gain influence if he handled the situation carefully. Instead of confronting the conspirators directly, Antony began to negotiate with them, attempting to prevent immediate violence while also protecting Caesar's legacy. The conspirators themselves were struggling with uncertainty. Although they had succeeded in killing Caesar, they had not fully planned how to control the political consequences of their actions. They hoped the Senate would quickly support them and declare that Caesar had been a tyrant whose death restored the Republic. Yet many senators were frightened and unsure which side to support. Some of them had respected Caesar, while others feared that opposing the conspirators might place their own lives in danger. Rome was now balanced on the edge of chaos, with different factions waiting to see who would gain control of the situation. During this tense period, negotiations began between the conspirators and Caesar's supporters. Eventually a temporary compromise was reached. The Senate agreed not to punish the conspirators immediately, while at the same time allowing Caesar's previous decisions and political reforms to remain valid. This agreement prevented immediate violence, but it did not resolve the deeper conflict dividing Roman society. Many citizens still mourned Caesar's death, and the soldiers who had once served under him remained loyal to his memory. Meanwhile, the conspirators hoped that time would convince the Roman people that their actions had been necessary for the survival of the Republic. One important question still remained unresolved: what would happen to Caesar's body and how would his death be presented to the public? According to Roman tradition, an important political leader deserved a public funeral. Allowing such a ceremony could be dangerous for the conspirators, because it might turn public sympathy toward Caesar and against them. Yet refusing a funeral could also anger the population. After intense debate, the Senate decided that Caesar would indeed receive a public funeral in Rome. This decision would soon prove to be one of the most important turning points in the entire story. During that funeral ceremony, powerful emotions would be unleashed among the Roman people, and the events that followed would push the Republic toward a new and even more destructive period of conflict. The conspirators believed the assassination had saved Rome, but they were about to discover that the death of Julius Caesar would ignite forces far beyond their control. In the tense days following the assassination of Julius Caesar, the city of Rome remained filled with uncertainty, fear, and growing anger. Although the conspirators believed they had saved the Roman Republic, the public reaction was far more complicated than they had expected. Many citizens had admired Caesar for his military victories, his generosity toward the poor, and the stability he had brought after years of civil war. As news of his brutal death spread through the streets, large crowds gathered in silence, trying to understand why such a powerful and popular leader had been murdered inside the Senate itself. Meanwhile, the conspirators led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus attempted to justify their actions by declaring that they had acted in defense of Roman freedom. They claimed that Caesar had been dangerously close to becoming a king and that his death was necessary to protect the ancient traditions of the Republic. Yet despite these claims, many Romans remained unconvinced. Caesar had been killed not on a battlefield but by fellow senators, men who had once served beside him in government. To ordinary citizens, the assassination felt less like a heroic act and more like a shocking betrayal. As the tension in the city continued to grow, attention soon turned toward one of Caesar's closest allies, Mark Antony. Antony had initially kept a low profile after the assassination, carefully avoiding open conflict with the conspirators. However, he soon realized that the upcoming funeral of Caesar could become a powerful moment to influence public opinion. The Senate had already agreed that Caesar would receive a public funeral according to Roman tradition. This decision would prove to be a turning point in the entire political crisis. On the day of the ceremony, thousands of Romans gathered in the public forum to pay their respects to the fallen leader. Caesar's body was brought into the center of the crowd, and the atmosphere was filled with grief, curiosity, and rising emotion. Many citizens had come simply to witness history, while others arrived to mourn a man they believed had served the people of Rome. Standing before the crowd was Mark Antony, who had been given permission to deliver a funeral speech. At first, Antony appeared calm and respectful. He began by speaking carefully about Caesar's achievements and reminding the audience of the victories he had won for Rome. But as his speech continued, Antony gradually shifted the tone, appealing directly to the emotions of the crowd. He spoke about Caesar's generosity, reminding the people that Caesar had often used his wealth to support public projects and help ordinary citizens. He also mentioned how Caesar had refused the crown when it had been offered to him, suggesting that the conspirators' accusations of tyranny might not be entirely truthful. Antony's speech became even more dramatic when he displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga to the crowd. As he pointed to the holes made by the daggers of the conspirators, he described how each wound had been inflicted by a man who had once claimed to be Caesar's friend. One of the most powerful moments came when Antony spoke about the betrayal of Marcus Junius Brutus, a man whom Caesar had trusted deeply. By emphasizing this betrayal, Antony transformed the assassination into a tragic story of loyalty and treachery. The emotional reaction of the crowd was immediate and explosive. What had begun as a quiet funeral gathering quickly turned into a wave of anger against the conspirators. People began shouting, crying, and demanding justice for Caesar's death. Antony then revealed another powerful surprise: Caesar's will. In the document, Caesar had reportedly left money to the citizens of Rome and even granted them access to his private gardens along the Tiber River as a public park. When the crowd heard this, their grief turned into fury. The image of Caesar as a generous leader contrasted sharply with the conspirators who had stabbed him to death. Within a short time, the situation in Rome spiraled out of control. Furious citizens began searching for the conspirators, and mobs formed in the streets. The funeral pyre itself was created spontaneously in the Roman Forum as people piled wood, furniture, and other objects together to burn Caesar's body. The flames rose high into the sky, symbolizing both the grief of the people and the growing chaos within the city. Meanwhile, the conspirators realized that the public mood had turned dangerously against them. The men who had believed they would be celebrated as heroes now found themselves hunted by angry crowds. One by one, they began fleeing Rome to escape retaliation. Leaders such as Brutus and Cassius quickly left the city, hoping to gather supporters in distant provinces where they could rebuild their strength. The assassination that was supposed to save the Republic had instead unleashed a powerful wave of unrest and revenge. The Roman world now stood on the edge of another major conflict, and the death of Julius Caesar had become the spark that would soon ignite a new series of civil wars that would ultimately reshape the future of Rome forever. After the emotional funeral of Julius Caesar, the city of Rome descended into a dangerous period of uncertainty and unrest. The powerful speech delivered by Mark Antony had ignited the emotions of the Roman people, transforming grief into anger against the conspirators who had carried out the assassination. Crowds filled the streets, shouting for justice and searching for the men responsible for Caesar's death. Fires burned in the Roman Forum as citizens created an enormous funeral pyre for Caesar's body, turning the public mourning into a dramatic symbol of both loss and fury. The conspirators, who had once believed they would be welcomed as heroes for defending the Republic, quickly realized that the situation had turned against them. Leaders of the conspiracy such as Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus understood that remaining in Rome would now be extremely dangerous. Instead of receiving praise for their actions, they were facing the possibility of violent retaliation from Caesar's supporters. Within days of the funeral, many of the conspirators began quietly leaving the city and traveling to distant provinces where they hoped to gather allies and rebuild their political strength. Brutus and Cassius believed that if they could organize armies in the eastern territories of the Roman world, they might still be able to defend their cause and justify the assassination as a necessary act to protect the Republic. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, a new struggle for power was beginning to take shape. Although Mark Antony had gained enormous popularity through his funeral speech, he was not the only figure seeking to control the political future of Rome. A young and relatively unknown man was about to enter the center of the story: Octavian, the adopted son and legal heir of Julius Caesar. Octavian was only 18 years old at the time of Caesar's assassination, but he possessed remarkable intelligence and political ambition. When he learned that Caesar had named him as his heir in his will, Octavian immediately understood that this inheritance carried not only wealth but also tremendous responsibility and opportunity. Determined to claim his place in Roman politics, Octavian quickly traveled toward Rome to present himself as the rightful successor of Caesar's legacy. At first, many experienced politicians underestimated the young man, believing he was too inexperienced to compete with powerful figures like Mark Antony. However, Octavian proved to be far more determined and strategic than anyone expected. By presenting himself as the defender of Caesar's memory, he began to win support among Caesar's former soldiers and loyal followers. At the same time, he carefully built alliances with influential senators who feared Antony's growing power. This situation soon created a complex and unstable political environment in Rome. On one side stood Mark Antony, a powerful general with strong support among Caesar's veterans. On another side was Octavian, the young heir who carried Caesar's name and legal inheritance. Meanwhile, the conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius were gathering forces in the eastern provinces, preparing for the possibility of open war. The Roman Republic was now divided into competing factions, each claiming to defend the true interests of Rome. As months passed, tensions between Antony and Octavian grew increasingly intense. Although both men claimed loyalty to Caesar's legacy, they distrusted each other and competed for influence over the Roman government. Eventually, however, they realized that continuing their rivalry would only strengthen the position of the conspirators who had killed Caesar. In order to defeat their common enemies, Antony and Octavian decided to form a temporary political alliance along with another powerful leader, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Together, the three men created a powerful governing coalition known as the Second Triumvirate. This alliance was officially recognized by Roman law and granted the three leaders extraordinary authority to restore order and punish those responsible for Caesar's assassination. One of the first and most brutal actions taken by the new triumvirs was a series of political purges known as proscriptions. Lists of enemies were published throughout Rome, and anyone whose name appeared on the list could be hunted down and executed. These proscriptions were designed to eliminate political opponents and raise money by confiscating the property of those who were killed. Among the victims of these purges was the famous Roman orator Cicero, who had openly criticized Mark Antony and now paid for his opposition with his life. As the triumvirs strengthened their power in Rome, they began preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the conspirators who had fled to the eastern provinces. Brutus and Cassius had been gathering armies and resources, hoping to defend their cause and prove that Caesar's assassination had been justified. Both sides now understood that the conflict could only be resolved on the battlefield. The death of Julius Caesar had not restored peace to the Roman Republic as the conspirators had hoped. Instead, it had unleashed a chain of events that was pushing the entire Roman world toward another massive civil war. The next stage of this dramatic struggle would take place far from Rome itself, on distant battlefields where the fate of Caesar's killers, and the future of the Republic, would finally be decided. As the months passed after the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Roman Republic became a stage for a rapidly escalating political and military struggle that no one could have fully predicted. The conspirators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, had retreated to the eastern provinces of the Roman world to gather forces and prepare for open confrontation with the men who now held power in Rome. Meanwhile, the triumvirs, Mark Antony, the young heir Octavian, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, had consolidated control over the city and initiated a campaign of political purges known as the proscriptions. These purges were merciless. Thousands of men who had opposed Caesar or been suspected of supporting the conspirators were hunted down, executed, and stripped of their property. Among the most famous victims was Cicero, the renowned orator and statesman, who had openly criticized Antony and paid with his life. The purges spread terror throughout Rome, but they also allowed the triumvirs to raise funds, recruit troops, and eliminate potential threats, strengthening their position for the inevitable military confrontation with Brutus and Cassius. In the eastern provinces, Brutus and Cassius worked tirelessly to build an army capable of challenging the triumvirs. They recruited legions of loyal soldiers who admired Caesar but believed that his assassination had been necessary to preserve the Republic. Their strategy was to consolidate power in the eastern territories, gather resources, and wait for the right moment to march on Rome itself. Both men were aware, however, that the coming conflict would be dangerous and unpredictable. Despite their careful planning, they knew that the combined forces of Antony and Octavian were formidable opponents, well supplied, and motivated by a desire for revenge. During this period, communication between the two sides was limited to letters and envoys, but even small pieces of information could alter strategies and heighten tensions. Brutus and Cassius tried to justify their cause not only to their soldiers but also to themselves. They argued that the assassination had been an act of patriotism, a defense of the ancient traditions of the Republic. Yet privately, both men must have wrestled with doubt. Even though they had eliminated Caesar, they could see the chaos his death had unleashed. Rome was no longer united, and the people were increasingly divided. Antony had skillfully turned public opinion against the conspirators, painting them as traitors who had murdered a beloved leader. As the armies of Brutus and Cassius moved through the eastern provinces, Antony and Octavian were consolidating power in Italy. They had successfully stabilized Rome and ensured that their control over the city was secure, allowing them to focus on confronting the eastern forces. Lepidus, although part of the triumvirate, played a smaller role in the military campaigns and largely managed affairs in central Italy. The real confrontation, however, would be between Antony and Octavian on one side and Brutus and Cassius on the other. By the time both sides were ready for battle, tension throughout the Roman world had reached a breaking point. Citizens, soldiers, and politicians were all aware that the coming conflict would determine not just the fate of individual leaders but also the future of Rome itself. The initial encounters between the armies of Brutus and Cassius and the forces of the triumvirs were cautious, with both sides seeking advantages through positioning, supplies, and morale. Yet despite the careful strategies, the shadow of Caesar's assassination loomed over every decision. Antony and Octavian were driven not only by a desire to consolidate power but also by vengeance for the death of their leader, while Brutus and Cassius were compelled by ideology, ambition, and a sense of historical duty. As the first major battles began, both sides suffered casualties, but the scale of the conflict quickly escalated. Reports of skirmishes, sieges, and tactical maneuvers spread through the Roman world, drawing attention from allies, neutral cities, and even distant provinces. The struggle was no longer confined to the Senate or the streets of Rome. It had become a full-scale civil war, fueled by loyalty, fear, revenge, and the unresolved tension created by Caesar's assassination. Throughout these campaigns, Brutus and Cassius demonstrated remarkable discipline and leadership. Their troops respected them for their commitment to what they believed was a noble cause. Yet they also faced internal challenges, including disagreements among officers, concerns about supplies, and the constant pressure of knowing that Antony and Octavian were consolidating power with each passing day. On the other side, Antony and Octavian coordinated closely, combining Antony's military experience and Octavian's strategic intelligence to gradually weaken the Eastern forces. The young Octavian, in particular, surprised many observers with his ability to inspire loyalty, manage logistics, and make calculated decisions that often anticipated the moves of Brutus and Cassius. The conflict was now escalating toward a decisive confrontation, a battle that would determine the outcome of the war and the ultimate fate of the Roman Republic. The death of Julius Caesar, which had once seemed like the solution to the Republic's troubles, had instead unleashed a chain of events that neither the conspirators nor the triumvirs could fully control. The Roman world was now caught in a whirlwind of military campaigns, political maneuvering, and shifting alliances, and the coming battles would decide not only who survived but whether the ideals of the Republic could endure in the face of ambition, vengeance, and the relentless pursuit of power. As the civil war following the assassination of Julius Caesar intensified, both sides prepared for what would become the decisive clash that would determine the future of the Roman Republic. Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus had successfully raised armies in the eastern provinces, rallying soldiers who admired Caesar's achievements but also believed that his death had been justified to protect the Republic. These legions were disciplined and motivated by a mixture of ideology, loyalty to Roman tradition, and a desire to restore balance to the political system that Caesar had disrupted. Despite this, Brutus and Cassius were acutely aware that Antony and Octavian commanded highly experienced and well-supplied forces in Italy. The two sides were separated by hundreds of miles, yet both understood that the confrontation was inevitable. The Eastern conspirators focused on fortifying key positions, securing supplies, and attempting to maintain the morale of their troops. They understood that the coming battle would not only be a test of military skill but also a struggle over legitimacy. Brutus, in particular, spent long hours speaking to his soldiers, invoking the ideals of the Republic, and framing the conflict as a moral duty rather than a personal vendetta. He reminded them of the history of Rome, the overthrow of kings centuries earlier, and the belief that no one man should wield absolute power. Cassius, while equally committed to the cause, was more pragmatic and sometimes impatient with appeals to ideology. He focused on strategy, logistics, and ensuring that their forces were ready to engage Antony and Octavian in open battle. In Rome and the surrounding territories, Antony and Octavian were coordinating their efforts with increasing precision. Antony, a seasoned general, provided experience and tactical knowledge, while Octavian, though young, displayed remarkable political and military acumen. Together, they worked to consolidate control over Italy, gather intelligence on Brutus and Cassius's movements, and secure the loyalty of legions that might otherwise have remained neutral. Both sides understood that the outcome of this conflict would not only determine who held power but also the political future of Rome itself. As word spread of the impending confrontation, the Roman populace watched with anxiety and anticipation. Many citizens had already mourned Caesar's death, and now the streets were filled with rumors of armies marching, potential battles, and the possibility of further bloodshed. The memory of the Ides of March and the brutal stabbing of Caesar loomed large over the minds of politicians, soldiers, and civilians alike. Morale on both sides was influenced not just by the capabilities of their armies but also by their perception of justice, honor, and historical legacy. On the day that the forces finally met, both sides arrayed themselves in formations that reflected months of preparation, study, and anticipation. Brutus and Cassius commanded the eastern legions, positioning troops strategically to maximize the advantages of terrain and defensive positions. They knew that Antony and Octavian would be aggressive and that their opponents' combined forces would likely outnumber them. Antony and Octavian, understanding the need for swift and decisive action, deployed their legions in tight formations designed to overwhelm the eastern forces while maintaining flexibility to respond to unexpected maneuvers. The battle began with careful reconnaissance, cavalry skirmishes, and probing attacks meant to test strength and resolve. Soldiers on both sides were acutely aware that the conflict was about far more than immediate victory. It was a struggle for legitimacy, revenge, and the very soul of Rome. As the clash intensified, the fighting became brutal and chaotic. The eastern legions initially held their ground, repelling attacks and demonstrating discipline despite facing a numerically superior enemy. Brutus and Cassius moved among their troops, offering encouragement, directing maneuvers, and ensuring that morale remained high even in the face of mounting pressure. Antony and Octavian coordinated their forces expertly, using flanking movements, combined infantry and cavalry tactics, and rapid communication to exploit any weaknesses in the eastern formations. Slowly, the advantage began to shift. Antony's experience and Octavian's strategic planning started to overwhelm the defenses of Brutus and Cassius, and casualties mounted on both sides. The chaos of battle, combined with the psychological weight of the conflict, began to wear down the conspirators' forces. Brutus, ever the idealist, tried to maintain order, reminding his men that they were fighting for a noble cause. Cassius, however, saw the danger clearly. If their forces collapsed, the consequences would be catastrophic. By the late afternoon, it became evident that Antony and Octavian's coordination and superior numbers were tipping the scales decisively. The eastern forces began to falter under relentless pressure, and disorder spread through the ranks. Brutus and Cassius realized that the moment of reckoning had arrived. They would either secure a victory that could justify Caesar's assassination or face total defeat and the destruction of their armies. The outcome of the battle would not only decide the fate of the conspirators themselves but also determine whether the Roman Republic could survive in its traditional form or whether it would be forever transformed by the violent legacy of Caesar's rise and assassination. In this crucial confrontation, every decision, every maneuver, and every act of courage or miscalculation carried consequences that would echo throughout history, shaping the future of Rome for generations to come. As the decisive battle between the forces of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus and those of Mark Antony and Octavian reached its climax, the eastern legions of the conspirators began to realize the gravity of their situation. The months of preparation, recruitment, and discipline were about to be tested in the harshest way possible. Brutus, ever the philosopher general, moved among his soldiers, reminding them of their noble cause and urging them to maintain courage even in the face of overwhelming odds. He invoked the principles of the Roman Republic, emphasizing that they fought not for personal gain but to protect the freedom of Rome from the threat of tyranny that Caesar's life and memory represented. Cassius, whose temperament was far more practical and impassioned, focused on the tactical necessities, maintaining formations, protecting key positions, and ensuring that supplies and reinforcements could reach the front lines. He knew that morale alone would not secure victory. Careful planning and adaptability were essential. The allied forces of Antony and Octavian advanced with precision, blending Antony's experience as a seasoned commander with Octavian's youthful cunning and strategic foresight. Their coordination allowed them to execute complex maneuvers, pressuring Brutus and Cassius from multiple directions while maintaining the cohesion of their own legions. The battle unfolded across open plains and undulating hills, the clash of swords and shields echoing across the landscape, punctuated by the cries of soldiers on both sides. Cavalry skirmishes, missile volleys, and sudden infantry charges created a chaotic yet disciplined struggle where moments of bravery and miscalculation alike could determine life or death. Despite the intensity of the fighting, Brutus maintained his calm, trying to inspire confidence in his troops through both presence and example. He rode along the lines, speaking to soldiers personally, reminding them that history would remember their courage and devotion to Rome's ideals. Cassius, however, became increasingly anxious as the tide of battle shifted against them. Reports of flanking maneuvers by Antony's forces and the relentless pressure from Octavian's legions suggested that their carefully prepared positions were beginning to falter. As the sun climbed higher, the intensity of the conflict reached its peak. Thousands of soldiers fought with a ferocity born of loyalty, fear, and desperation. Each side knew that failure could mean annihilation, not only of their armies but also of their political cause. Brutus and Cassius coordinated counterattacks where possible, attempting to exploit weaknesses in Antony and Octavian's formations, but the superior numbers and experience of their opponents gradually gained the advantage. In the midst of the chaos, acts of heroism and tragedy unfolded on both sides. Soldiers who had trained together for years fell side by side. Officers who had strategized for months were struck down in moments of sudden violence. Brutus himself continued to lead from the front, embodying the Stoic ideals that had guided him through the political turmoil following Caesar's assassination. Yet even the steadfastness of Brutus could not fully offset the relentless assault by Antony's forces. By the afternoon, Cassius realized that their position was untenable. Reports of failing units, increasing casualties, and encroaching enemy lines confirmed his worst fears. The battle was slipping from their control. With grim resolve, Cassius acknowledged that their defeat was likely and began to make contingency plans to preserve what remained of their forces. Brutus, though aware of the deteriorating situation, refused to concede defeat prematurely. His commitment to the ideals of the Republic and the moral justification for their actions compelled him to continue fighting, hoping that a decisive action could still turn the tide. However, the combined pressure of Antony and Octavian's coordination, the exhaustion of his troops, and the overwhelming numbers of the enemy began to erode even Brutus's determination. The eastern forces gradually gave ground, falling back to secondary positions while attempting to regroup and maintain cohesion. The psychological toll of the battle weighed heavily on all participants. For the conspirators, this was not only a fight for survival but a reckoning with the consequences of Caesar's assassination. For Antony and Octavian, it was both vengeance and a struggle to solidify their emerging dominance over the Roman world. As the day wore on, the casualties mounted, and both sides experienced moments of confusion, miscommunication, and fear. The clash, intense and relentless, demonstrated not only the tactical skills of the commanders but also the deep human cost of political ambition and betrayal. The struggle, though centered on armies and strategies, was inseparable from the broader narrative of Rome's transformation. The violent end of Caesar's life had unleashed forces far beyond any single man's control, and the outcome of this battle would not simply be military but historical. By late afternoon, it became increasingly clear that the conspirators' forces were collapsing under sustained pressure. Antony and Octavian's superior coordination and relentless attacks had broken the cohesion of the eastern legions, forcing retreats and creating openings for decisive strikes. Despite this, Brutus remained resolute, determined to lead his remaining soldiers with honor and commitment to the ideals for which they had taken up arms. The day's battle, a culmination of months of political maneuvering, ideological struggle, and military preparation, had set the stage for the final acts of the conflict. It had shown the limits of bravery against superior coordination, the fragility of ideals in the face of practical realities, and the unstoppable momentum of history once set in motion by the assassination of Julius Caesar. The outcome of this confrontation would soon seal the fate of the conspirators and determine whether the Roman Republic could survive, or whether Caesar's death had paved the way for a new era dominated by the forces that Antony and Octavian now represented. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon on the battlefield where the forces of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus had clashed with those of Mark Antony and Octavian, the reality of the Eastern legion's defeat became undeniable. Months of careful planning, recruitment, and preparation had come to a catastrophic conclusion for the conspirators, whose idealism had collided with the relentless pragmatism and tactical coordination of their opponents. Brutus, riding among the remaining troops, attempted to maintain calm and discipline, reminding them that even in defeat, they fought for a cause larger than themselves. Yet the morale of the soldiers was crumbling, exhaustion had set in, and the steady advance of Antony and Octavian's forces left little room for hope. Cassius, increasingly desperate, realized that their only chance to preserve any semblance of their army lay in retreating to more defensible positions and attempting to regroup. He issued orders to pull back, organize the remaining men, and avoid total annihilation, knowing full well that Antony and Octavian would pursue relentlessly. The retreat, however, was chaotic. Confusion among the ranks, compounded by the loss of officers and the fatigue of the soldiers, made the movement perilous. Small units became separated, supply lines were disrupted, and the psychological weight of the defeat pressed heavily on everyone present. Brutus continued to encourage his men, emphasizing honor and duty, yet even his presence could not entirely counter the growing despair. Antony, recognizing the strategic advantage, pressed his forces forward with calculated aggression. His soldiers, motivated by vengeance for Caesar and by loyalty to his command, pressed the attack with precision, exploiting every opening and weakness in the disorganized conspirator lines. Octavian, young but remarkably strategic, coordinated flanking maneuvers, cutting off escape routes and further destabilizing the remaining eastern forces. The conspirators' retreat became increasingly perilous as Antony's legions surrounded isolated units and forced surrender in multiple locations. Brutus and Cassius were forced to make decisions under extreme pressure, balancing the desire to fight honorably with the practical need to save their lives and any remaining soldiers. The day was marked by desperate skirmishes, close combat, and the collapse of many formations that had only hours before seemed reliable and disciplined. Despite their best efforts, it became evident that the conspirators' cause was unraveling. The symbolic idealism that had motivated them, the belief that Caesar's assassination could restore the Republic, was being overtaken by the harsh realities of military defeat, the skill of their enemies, and the unpredictable consequences of their own actions. Brutus, understanding the gravity of the situation, began planning a final retreat toward more secure eastern territories where regrouping might still be possible. Cassius, however, was tormented by despair, his confidence eroded by the relentless advance of Antony and Octavian and the mounting casualties among their forces. Nightfall provided temporary relief from the chaos of battle, allowing the surviving soldiers to consolidate in small encampments and assess the losses of the day. Brutus gathered with the remaining officers to discuss strategy, morale, and the next steps, but the sense of inevitability weighed heavily on all present. They had fought valiantly, but the momentum of Antony and Octavian's forces was overwhelming, and the political consequences of the defeat loomed as ominously as the military ones. Meanwhile, Antony and Octavian, aware of the opportunity presented by the nightfall, used scouts and light cavalry to monitor the retreating forces, ensuring that no large group could escape to reorganize without surveillance. They understood that the total collapse of Brutus and Cassius's armies would not only cement their military dominance but also eliminate the ideological opposition that had arisen from Caesar's assassination. The retreating eastern forces moved cautiously, attempting to avoid ambushes and regroup wherever possible, but the psychological toll of the defeat was evident. Soldiers questioned their chances of survival, officers debated the best course of action, and the once unified cause of protecting the Republic began to fracture under the strain of loss and fear. Brutus, remaining resolute, attempted to inspire confidence, reminding his men that even in defeat, honor could be preserved through courage, discipline, and adherence to principle. Yet Cassius, overwhelmed by despair and guilt, began to doubt that any honor could survive in the face of total collapse. The night passed with uneasy rest, the survivors aware that the coming days would determine not only their personal fates but the fate of the republican ideals they had sought to defend. In Rome, news of the Eastern forces' defeat began to filter slowly through political channels, causing ripples of uncertainty, speculation, and anticipation among the Senate, citizens, and military commanders. Antony and Octavian's position was strengthened, yet they understood that the final resolution required the complete neutralization of Brutus and Cassius's remaining forces. The stage was set for the ultimate conclusion of the civil conflict that had erupted following Caesar's assassination. The ideals of the Republic, the ambitions of men, and the consequences of betrayal converged in a historical moment whose outcomes would resonate throughout Rome and the wider Mediterranean world. Brutus and Cassius, though battered and demoralized, knew that the final chapter of their struggle was imminent. The events of that day and the following nights would decide the ultimate fate of the conspirators, the future of Roman governance, and the enduring legacy of Julius Caesar's death, a legacy that had set in motion forces far larger than any single individual could control. The days following the crushing defeat of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces at the hands of Mark Antony and Octavian were filled with tension, despair, and grim calculations. Brutus and Cassius, once confident that their armies and ideals could challenge the rising power of the triumvirs, now faced the stark reality that the balance of military and political power had irrevocably shifted. Retreating through the eastern provinces, they attempted to regroup, reinforce, and rebuild what remained of their forces, but the psychological weight of their failure hung over them like a shadow. Soldiers whispered doubts, some deserting in fear, others questioning whether the cause of defending the Roman Republic could still justify the bloodshed and suffering that had unfolded. Cassius, increasingly anxious and despairing, struggled to maintain discipline among the troops. He knew that morale was the fragile thread holding the army together. Once it snapped, their chances of survival, and any hope of influencing Rome's future, would vanish. Brutus, by contrast, maintained his stoic composure, attempting to rally his men with words of philosophy and appeals to honor. He reminded them that even in the face of defeat, courage, principle, and loyalty were worth preserving. Yet even Brutus could not ignore the looming threat of Antony and Octavian's pursuit. The triumvirs, understanding that the remnants of the eastern legions could consolidate and attempt a final strike, moved swiftly and decisively to prevent any chance of recovery. Antony's experience and ruthlessness, combined with Octavian's strategic intelligence and growing popularity, allowed them to anticipate Brutus and Cassius's movements and cut off avenues of retreat. Every skirmish, ambush, and maneuver further depleted the morale and numbers of the conspirators' forces, leaving them increasingly isolated. The once confident conspirators were now forced to confront not only the physical reality of a defeated army but also the political and symbolic implications of their failure. Their hope of restoring the Roman Republic had collapsed alongside their military strength, and the very ideals they had fought for now seemed vulnerable to the ambitions of the triumvirs. As the pursuit continued, tension among the remaining officers intensified. Disagreements over strategy, retreat routes, and whether to engage in a last desperate stand began to surface. Soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, struggled to maintain discipline, while the constant pressure from Antony and Octavian's forces made any organized response increasingly difficult. The psychological toll was immense. The conspirators faced the knowledge that their actions, taken in what they believed was defense of liberty, had unleashed forces beyond their control, and now their own survival was uncertain. Brutus and Cassius were acutely aware that capture by the triumvirs would mean not only death but the symbolic humiliation of their cause. They discussed the possibility of honorable self-destruction, a path that would allow them to maintain their principles even in the face of absolute defeat. Cassius, in particular, wrestled with despair, haunted by the memory of Caesar's assassination and the irreversible consequences of their decisions. Brutus, though steadfast, understood the inevitability of a final confrontation. As they continued through hostile territory, the two leaders attempted to maintain cohesion, keeping the remaining legions together for as long as possible. Every movement was calculated to avoid confrontation until they could choose the terms of any final battle, or, failing that, the timing and place of their own deaths to preserve honor. Antony and Octavian, aware of the conspirators' desperation, tightened the noose. Their forces pursued relentlessly, combining military pressure with psychological tactics, spreading news of defections and victories to further demoralize Brutus and Cassius's remaining troops. Supplies became scarce, communication lines faltered, and the ability of the conspirators to maintain order steadily eroded. By the time they reached a defensible position, the conspirators' army was a shadow of its former self, weakened by exhaustion, attrition, and the constant stress of pursuit. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a battle not only between armies but between competing visions of Rome's future, between the ideals that had motivated Caesar's assassins and the emerging reality of power concentrated in the hands of Antony and Octavian. Brutus and Cassius faced the inevitability of either a final defeat in combat or the grim alternative of choosing death on their own terms. Both leaders reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point, the murder of Caesar, the hope of restoring the Republic, the brief moments of control, and now the inexorable collapse of their plans. Soldiers clung to their loyalty, yet fear and exhaustion undermined their courage, leaving the conspirators with few options. Antony and Octavian, understanding the significance of the moment, prepared to press their advantage, determined to decisively end the threat posed by Caesar's assassins. The tension was suffocating, every decision, every maneuver, and every act of courage or hesitation could determine the fate of the Republic, the legacy of Caesar, and the lives of Brutus and Cassius themselves. As the night fell and the final day of confrontation approached, the Eastern legions prepared for what could only be a desperate, final stand, a culmination of months of political intrigue, betrayal, and civil war that had begun with the brutal murder of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, and which would soon reach its tragic and historic conclusion. The final hours leading up to the decisive confrontation between Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus on one side, and Mark Antony and Octavian on the other, were marked by tension, dread, and an acute awareness that the outcome would determine not only their lives but the fate of the Roman Republic itself. After weeks of retreat, skirmishes, and relentless pursuit, the remnants of Brutus and Cassius's eastern legions were battered, exhausted, and demoralized. Yet despite the hopelessness of the situation, the conspirators attempted to preserve discipline, fortify positions, and inspire courage among their men, knowing that the honor of their cause and their own personal legacies depended on how they faced the inevitable. Brutus, calm and steadfast, reminded his soldiers that they fought not for personal gain but for the ideals of liberty and the protection of the Republic, invoking Stoic principles to strengthen their resolve. Cassius, in contrast, was consumed by despair and frustration, anguished over the catastrophic consequences of Caesar's assassination and the failures of their strategy. He moved among the troops, attempting to maintain order, but even his authority could not entirely offset the fear spreading through the ranks. Meanwhile, Antony and Octavian prepared meticulously for the final engagement. Antony's battlefield experience and Octavian's tactical ingenuity created a formidable combination, allowing them to coordinate complex maneuvers and anticipate the moves of the conspirators. Their legions, well supplied, disciplined, and motivated by both vengeance for Caesar and a desire to consolidate power, advanced with precision, leaving little room for error. Every decision, from positioning to timing, reflected the careful calculation of commanders determined to secure complete victory. As the two armies finally faced each other on the plains, the air was thick with anticipation. Thousands of soldiers, aware that this confrontation would determine the survival of their leaders and the political direction of Rome, readied themselves for battle. The clash began with cautious probing and skirmishes, each side testing the other's strength, formations, and morale. For hours, the battle swayed uncertainly, with moments of advantage for both sides, but gradually the superior coordination, numbers, and experience of Antony and Octavian began to dominate the field. Brutus and Cassius fought valiantly, moving among their soldiers to inspire courage and maintain order, but the tide of battle was turning against them. Antony and Octavian executed flanking maneuvers, exploited gaps, and applied relentless pressure, gradually eroding the strength of the eastern legions. The casualties mounted on both sides, yet the conspirators' losses were increasingly disproportionate, and the psychological weight of defeat began to manifest in disorder, confusion, and fear. Brutus, ever the idealist, continued to emphasize honor and duty, hoping that his steadfastness might inspire a rally or at least a disciplined retreat. Cassius, however, recognized the inevitable: the battle could no longer be won. He saw the disintegration of his forces and understood that continued fighting would result only in unnecessary death. Nightfall approached, and with it, the grim reality of their situation became undeniable. Brutus and Cassius convened with their remaining officers, discussing whether to attempt a last desperate maneuver, surrender, or take their own lives to preserve personal honor. Soldiers, exhausted and terrified, clung to the hope that some miracle might yet occur, but deep down many understood that the end was near. Antony and Octavian, aware of the conspirators' weakening position, circled cautiously, applying pressure while avoiding unnecessary risk. They knew that once the Eastern forces were decisively broken, the political and military threat posed by Caesar's assassins would be eliminated. In the final hours before the decisive conclusion, Brutus reflected on the path that had brought him here, the idealism that had motivated the assassination, the initial hope that Rome could be preserved through the death of Caesar, and the unanticipated chaos and civil war that had followed. Cassius, overwhelmed by despair, considered the symbolic meaning of honor and death, recognizing that the ideals they had fought for might survive only through his own and Brutus's final acts. The soldiers on both sides, weary and bloodied, understood that the coming confrontation would be decisive, that their actions would echo through history, and that the future of Rome rested precariously on the outcomes of courage, strategy, and chance. As night fell over the battlefield, a tense stillness settled over the encampments, each side preparing for the final engagement at dawn. Brutus and Cassius, though battered and demoralized, resolved to face whatever came with the principles that had guided them throughout their lives. Antony and Octavian, confident but vigilant, awaited the first light, knowing that victory would solidify their power and ensure the triumph of Caesar's legacy. In this charged and fateful moment, the stage was set for the ultimate resolution of the civil war unleashed by the assassination of Julius Caesar, a resolution that would determine the fate of the conspirators, the Republic, and the future of Rome itself. As dawn broke over the plains where the remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces had gathered for a final stand, the tension was almost unbearable. Months of retreat, skirmishes, and attrition had left the Eastern legions battered, exhausted, and deeply demoralized, yet Brutus and Cassius refused to concede that their cause, the defense of the Roman Republic, had failed. Brutus, maintaining his stoic composure, moved among the remaining soldiers, speaking words of encouragement, invoking the honor of their struggle, and reminding them that their actions, even in the face of defeat, were motivated by principle and justice. Cassius, however, was consumed with despair. He had watched their carefully prepared plans unravel, witnessed countless men fall, and now faced the reality that Antony and Octavian's superior coordination and relentless pursuit had left them little room to maneuver. The conspirators understood that the coming confrontation would determine the very survival of their ideals, as well as their lives. Antony and Octavian, aware of the precarious position of their opponents, advanced with meticulous precision. Antony, experienced and calculating, positioned his legions to exploit the weaknesses of the Eastern forces, while Octavian, brilliant in strategy despite his youth, coordinated flanking movements and ensured that his troops maintained cohesion. Their forces moved like a single organism, combining discipline, experience, and the fervor of men motivated by vengeance for Caesar's death and the ambition to secure their own ascendancy. As the first skirmishes erupted, the clash of swords, the cries of men, and the pounding of hooves filled the air. The Eastern legions initially attempted to hold their lines, using terrain and fortifications to their advantage, but the relentless pressure applied by Antony and Octavian began to erode both the physical formations and the morale of the soldiers. Brutus rode among the ranks, attempting to steady men whose courage faltered under the weight of exhaustion, fear, and the mounting casualties. He reminded them of their mission, of the republic they had sworn to protect, and of the honor that could be preserved even in defeat. Cassius, in contrast, struggled to maintain control as panic spread through units isolated by the enemy's maneuvers. Reports of broken formations, flanking attacks, and the collapse of supply lines heightened the sense of impending disaster. As the day wore on, the battle grew more chaotic and brutal. Antony and Octavian's legions pressed forward with discipline and coordinated force, gradually overwhelming the eastern lines. Soldiers fought with desperation, yet their strength waned under continuous assault. Brutus and Cassius were forced to make split-second decisions: where to deploy reserves, when to commit to counterattacks, and when to attempt tactical withdrawals. The physical exhaustion and psychological strain were compounded by the knowledge that the Republic itself, the cause they had believed justified the assassination of Caesar, now seemed to hang by a thread. Despite their valiant efforts, the eastern legions began to break. Isolated units were cut off, soldiers surrendered or fled, and the coordinated counterattacks Brutus and Cassius had hoped to execute faltered under relentless pressure. Antony and Octavian exploited every weakness, their forces moving with precision to encircle, cut off, and dismantle the remaining resistance. By late afternoon, it was evident that the battle could no longer be won by the conspirators. Cassius, overwhelmed by despair and witnessing the collapse of his forces, began to consider the unthinkable, that the only way to preserve honor in the face of inevitable defeat might be to take his own life. Brutus, though determined to maintain composure and inspire courage, recognized the grim reality. The ideals for which they had fought were being overtaken by the relentless momentum of Antony and Octavian's forces. As night approached, the survivors of the eastern legions gathered in small, disorganized clusters, attempting to regroup and assess what remained of their strength. Brutus convened with his officers, discussing possible strategies for withdrawal, surrender, or a final stand, but the hopelessness of their situation was clear. Antony and Octavian, vigilant even as darkness fell, understood that the remnants of Brutus and Cassius's forces could still pose a threat if allowed to regroup, and they prepared to maintain pressure at first light. The psychological impact of the battle weighed heavily on all involved. Soldiers who had once believed in the righteousness of their cause now questioned whether the Republic could survive, whether their loyalty had been misplaced, and whether the sacrifices they had made would ever be remembered. Brutus, steadfast in his commitment to principle, attempted to inspire hope, but even he could not ignore the inevitability of the approaching conclusion. The stage was set for the final act of the civil war triggered by Caesar's assassination. Antony and Octavian, with their forces intact and coordinated, represented the unstoppable force of vengeance, ambition, and political calculation. Brutus and Cassius, though valiant, were now the embodiment of a doomed idealism, facing the consequences of a decision that had reshaped Rome in ways they had never fully anticipated. As night enveloped the battlefield, a tense stillness settled, a brief interlude before the final confrontation at dawn that would seal the fates of the conspirators, determine the ultimate outcome of the civil war, and decide the future of the Roman Republic, a future irrevocably altered by the murder of Julius Caesar and the relentless momentum of history that his death had unleashed. As the first light of dawn crept over the battlefield where Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus had made their final stand, the weight of impending doom hung over the remaining eastern legions. Months of retreat, skirmishes, and attrition had left Brutus and Cassius's forces exhausted, demoralized, and severely reduced in number. Yet the leaders remained determined to confront their fate with courage and a sense of honor, understanding that this battle would decide not only their survival but the fate of the ideals that had compelled them to assassinate Julius Caesar. Brutus moved along the lines of his remaining troops, invoking Stoic philosophy, reminding soldiers that their courage, discipline, and adherence to principle mattered as much as the outcome of the battle. He emphasized that even in the face of inevitable defeat, they could maintain dignity and loyalty to the Republic. Cassius, increasingly tormented by despair and the mounting evidence of defeat, attempted to keep order among the scattered soldiers, issuing urgent commands, attempting to patch gaps in the formations, and coordinating defensive positions. Yet the relentless advance of Mark Antony and Octavian left little room for effective maneuvering. Antony, a seasoned commander, exploited every opportunity to destabilize the conspirators' lines, using tactical feints, coordinated cavalry movements, and disciplined infantry charges to break the cohesion of Brutus and Cassius's forces. Octavian, brilliant in strategy despite his youth, directed flanking maneuvers, ensured communication between units, and anticipated the conspirators' movements with a clarity that unnerved even the most steadfast officers. The Eastern legions, though disciplined and motivated by loyalty and ideology, were increasingly overwhelmed. Skirmishes turned into chaotic close-quarters combat, with soldiers exhausted, disoriented, and suffering under the psychological strain of relentless pressure. Brutus rode among his men, striving to inspire courage and maintain order, while Cassius became consumed with the grim recognition that their cause, though morally justified in their eyes, had little chance of surviving the day. Throughout the morning, the tide of battle continued to shift decisively in favor of Antony and Octavian. Isolated units of the conspirators' forces were surrounded, supply lines cut, and communication disrupted, leaving many soldiers confused and fearful. Despite their best efforts, Brutus and Cassius could not prevent the gradual collapse of their army. Each clash, each failed counterattack, and each lost position chipped away at their remaining strength. As midday approached, the pressure became unbearable. The conspirators were forced to make impossible choices: continue fighting against overwhelming odds, attempt a disorganized retreat, or accept that their personal fates might soon be sealed. The psychological strain weighed heavily on both leaders. Brutus clung to Stoic ideals, emphasizing honor and the preservation of moral integrity even in the face of death. Cassius, however, felt the crushing weight of despair and helplessness, recognizing that their military defeat was now inevitable and that further resistance might only prolong suffering and bloodshed. Antony and Octavian, aware of the conspirators' weakened state, pressed relentlessly. Their forces exploited every gap, applied constant pressure, and ensured that no coordinated counterattack could succeed. The field became a scene of chaos, courage, and desperation, with soldiers fighting valiantly even as their formations broke apart under superior coordination and strategy. By the late afternoon, the fate of Brutus and Cassius's forces was all but sealed. Antony and Octavian's tactical superiority, combined with the psychological exhaustion of the conspirators, made any hope of victory impossible. In the remaining encampments, officers debated whether to surrender, fight to the last man, or take their own lives to preserve honor. Soldiers, demoralized and fearful, increasingly looked to their leaders for guidance, uncertain whether survival, honor, or death should dictate their actions. Brutus, aware of the grim reality but determined to maintain dignity and inspire his men, prepared for the final confrontation, accepting that the ultimate outcome was beyond his control. Cassius, overwhelmed by despair, recognized that the only way to assert control over his fate might be to choose death on his own terms rather than face capture or execution by Antony and Octavian. As nightfall approached, the battlefield fell into a tense stillness. The surviving soldiers huddled in small, weary groups, the sounds of distant preparation by the triumvir's forces reminding them that the decisive end was imminent. Brutus and Cassius conferred quietly, contemplating the next steps, weighing the preservation of honor against the reality of annihilation, and preparing themselves for the final act of a conflict that had begun with Caesar's assassination. Antony and Octavian, vigilant and disciplined, anticipated the movements of the remaining Eastern forces, ready to deliver the final blow. The stage was set for a historic conclusion, a confrontation that would not only seal the fate of Brutus and Cassius but also determine the future of Rome, the republic they had sought to defend, and the legacy of Julius Caesar's death, a legacy that had unleashed forces far beyond anyone's control and would shape the course of Roman history for generations to come. As the first light of dawn illuminated the battlefield, the remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces prepared for the confrontation that would ultimately decide the fate of the Roman Republic and the personal legacies of the conspirators. Weeks of retreat, skirmishes, and relentless pursuit by Mark Antony and Octavian had left the Eastern legions battered, demoralized, and fractured. Despite this, Brutus maintained a stoic composure, moving among his soldiers to bolster their morale, reminding them that they fought for principle, honor, and the ideals of liberty rather than personal gain. His presence offered a measure of reassurance, though even his unyielding resolve could not fully shield the troops from the mounting fear and exhaustion. Cassius, by contrast, was consumed with despair, his once calculated decisions now overshadowed by the grim reality that the battle might be lost before it truly began. He struggled to maintain cohesion among the scattered units, issuing orders that were increasingly difficult to enforce, as fatigue, confusion, and the psychological toll of previous defeats weakened the soldiers' discipline. Antony and Octavian, cognizant of the conspirators' precarious position, approached the day with methodical precision. Antony, a general seasoned in warfare, leveraged tactical feints, coordinated cavalry charges, and disciplined infantry advances to disorient and divide Brutus and Cassius's already strained forces. Octavian, young yet cunning, orchestrated flanking maneuvers and maintained communication between his units, ensuring that Antony's main forces could exploit any weakness that appeared in the eastern formations. As the two armies clashed in the morning light, the battlefield became a maelstrom of noise, violence, and chaos. Swords clanged, shields splintered, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. The eastern legions, though still disciplined in pockets, were steadily overwhelmed by the superior coordination, numbers, and morale of Antony and Octavian's troops. Brutus rode among his men, exhorting them to hold the line and to fight for honor, invoking the virtues of courage and loyalty to inspire them even as the tide turned relentlessly against them. Cassius, meanwhile, grappled with the realization that their defeat was inevitable. He observed the gradual disintegration of their formations, the faltering morale of his soldiers, and the relentless advance of the enemy, recognizing that continued resistance would likely result in total annihilation. By midday, Antony and Octavian's forces had begun to dominate the field. Strategic encirclements cut off retreat paths, while relentless assaults sapped the remaining strength of the eastern legions. Isolated groups of conspirators fought bravely but were quickly overwhelmed, leaving Brutus and Cassius with only fragmented units under their command. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had joined the cause to defend the Republic now questioned whether their ideals could survive and whether their sacrifices had been in vain. Brutus, though aware of the hopelessness, continued to maintain composure, hoping to instill courage and a sense of purpose among the men who still looked to him for guidance. Cassius, increasingly desperate, began to contemplate the final act that could preserve personal honor, the possibility of taking his own life rather than surrendering to the triumvirs. The late afternoon brought a grim clarity. The eastern legions were collapsing under sustained pressure, their formations broken, their supply lines severed, and their morale nearly extinguished. Antony and Octavian pressed relentlessly, ensuring that no respite could be taken and that the remaining conspirators had no opportunity to regroup or reorganize. In small encampments and scattered defensive positions, officers debated their options: to continue fighting, attempt a risky retreat, or embrace death on their own terms. Soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, increasingly relied on their leaders' judgment, awaiting guidance amid chaos and fear. Brutus resolved to face the inevitable with dignity, instructing his men to prepare for a final stand, emphasizing that even in defeat, their courage and adherence to principle would endure in history. Cassius, though torn by despair, accepted the likelihood of his own demise, weighing the preservation of honor against the certainty of capture or execution. As night fell, a tense stillness settled over the battlefield. Antony and Octavian's forces maintained vigilance, anticipating any movement by the remaining conspirators. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the dawn would bring the final confrontation, used the night to consolidate what remained of their troops, reflect on the months of political intrigue and civil war that had followed Caesar's assassination, and prepare mentally for the ultimate reckoning. Every thought, every calculation, every word spoken among the conspirators carried the weight of history, for the outcome of the coming hours would determine not only who survived but whether the Roman Republic could endure, whether the ideals of liberty would be preserved, and how the murder of Julius Caesar would echo across time. In the shadow of impending catastrophe, Brutus and Cassius faced the inexorable consequences of their actions, a combination of ambition, idealism, betrayal, and political necessity that had set Rome on a path from which there could be no return. The stage was now set for the climactic resolution of a conflict born from one man's death, a resolution that would decide the fate of the conspirators, the triumph of Antony and Octavian, and the ultimate transformation of Rome from a republic threatened by internal strife to an empire shaped by the forces unleashed on the Ides of March. The dawn of the fateful day arrived with a somber stillness over the battlefield, the air thick with anticipation and the lingering shadows of the Eastern legion's retreat. Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, weary from weeks of skirmishes, exhaustion, and the psychological weight of their looming defeat, surveyed what remained of their forces. Brutus, resolute and composed despite the circumstances, rode along the lines, addressing his soldiers with calm authority, invoking the Stoic ideals that had guided his life, and reminding them that their actions, though now facing overwhelming odds, were motivated by principle and the preservation of the Republic. The men listened, inspired by his presence, yet even the bravest among them felt the gnawing fear of facing the combined might of Mark Antony and Octavian. Cassius, in contrast, wrestled with despair. The knowledge that their carefully constructed plans had failed, that their troops were fractured and demoralized, and that their enemies advanced with relentless precision weighed heavily on him. He attempted to rally the men, issue tactical commands, and maintain order, but even his authority could not fully counter the fatigue and fear that had taken hold of the Eastern legions. Antony and Octavian, confident yet cautious, moved their forces with meticulous precision. Antony's battlefield experience allowed him to exploit weaknesses in the conspirators' formations, while Octavian's strategic insight ensured that every maneuver complemented the broader plan to encircle, overwhelm, and decisively defeat the Eastern forces. The first clashes erupted as both sides tested each other with probing attacks. The sound of swords striking shields, the cries of the wounded, and the thunder of hooves filled the air as disciplined formations clashed in chaotic bursts of violence. Initially, pockets of Brutus and Cassius's forces held firm, fighting with courage inspired by loyalty to their leaders and the ideals they cherished. Yet, as the morning progressed, the relentless pressure from Antony and Octavian began to fracture the Eastern lines. Tactical feints and coordinated attacks gradually undermined the conspirators' positions, forcing them to commit reserves to defend breaches and counter flanking maneuvers. Brutus moved constantly among the ranks, exhorting the soldiers to hold the line and fight with honor, reminding them that courage in the face of overwhelming odds preserved their dignity even in defeat. Cassius, increasingly aware of the inexorability of their situation, watched as units fell into disarray, some surrendering, others retreating in confusion, and the overall cohesion of their army weakened by relentless enemy pressure. By midday, the Eastern legions were crumbling under the sustained assaults. Antony and Octavian's forces exploited every lapse, cutting off isolated groups, severing supply lines, and disorienting the remaining troops. Brutus and Cassius faced impossible decisions: continue to resist in scattered engagements, attempt a precarious retreat, or embrace death on their own terms to preserve honor. The psychological strain on both leaders was immense. Brutus clung to ideals, believing that even in defeat, his actions and those of his men could leave a lasting legacy of courage and principle. Cassius, consumed by despair, acknowledged the hopelessness of continued resistance and began contemplating the act that would allow him to retain agency over his fate. The late afternoon brought a grim clarity. The Eastern legions, battered, fragmented, and surrounded in part by Antony and Octavian's disciplined forces, could not hope to regain the initiative. Efforts to regroup were met with relentless attacks, and the remaining soldiers faced the stark reality of imminent defeat. In scattered encampments, officers debated whether to fight to the last man or commit acts of self-preservation through death, while the rank and file, exhausted and demoralized, looked to Brutus and Cassius for guidance. Brutus, maintaining composure, prepared to lead his men in what remained of their final engagement, emphasizing that honor, courage, and adherence to principle mattered more than victory itself. Cassius, despairing yet resolute in his own way, accepted that his role in the unfolding history of Rome might conclude not in triumph, but in a deliberate, honorable end. As night approached, a tense quiet settled over the battlefield. Antony and Octavian, aware that dawn would bring the final confrontation, kept their forces alert and strategically positioned, ready to deliver a decisive blow. Brutus and Cassius, consolidating what remained of their troops, contemplated the choices that would define their legacies and seal the fate of their ideals. Every movement, every plan, every word of counsel carried the weight of history, for the outcome of the coming hours would decide not only who survived, but whether the Roman Republic could endure in any form, and how the murder of Julius Caesar would echo through time. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution of a civil war born of ambition, betrayal, and the violent death of a leader, a resolution that would forever transform Rome, determine the fates of the conspirators, and shape the legacy of one of history's most pivotal political assassinations. The final act was imminent, and the forces of history, vengeance, and ideology converged on that bloodied, tension-filled plain, ready to determine the future of a republic teetering on the edge of transformation. As the pale light of dawn stretched across the battlefield, the remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces braced for the confrontation that would seal the fate of their cause and their lives, the air thick with anticipation, fear, and the echoes of battles past. Weeks of retreat, skirmishes, and the relentless pursuit of Mark Antony and Octavian had left the Eastern legions depleted, fractured, and mentally exhausted. Brutus moved among the soldiers, his demeanor calm, measured, and composed, invoking Stoic philosophy to inspire courage and reminding them that their actions were rooted in principle, honor, and the defense of the Republic. He spoke of the virtue of fighting with integrity, of holding steadfast to ideals even in the face of overwhelming odds, and of the legacy their courage might leave in the annals of Rome. Cassius, by contrast, was consumed with the weight of despair. The repeated failures of strategy, the scattering of troops, and the relentless advance of Antony and Octavian had left him questioning whether any measure of honor or principle could survive in such a landscape of devastation. He moved through the ranks, issuing tactical orders, attempting to shore up defenses and coordinate movements, yet the psychological strain on the men, and on himself, was palpable. Antony and Octavian approached the battlefield with calculated precision. Antony, a general seasoned by years of military command, exploited every opportunity to destabilize the eastern formations, executing feints, coordinated cavalry strikes, and disciplined infantry charges to apply unrelenting pressure. Octavian, young yet astute in strategy, anticipated the conspirators' maneuvers, directed flanking operations, and maintained communication and cohesion among his units, ensuring that Antony's attacks were always complemented by supportive movements. As the first engagement erupted, the clash of arms, the thunder of hooves, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. The Eastern legions, though still exhibiting pockets of valor and discipline, were steadily pushed back by the superior coordination, numbers, and morale of Antony and Octavian's forces. Brutus rode along the lines, exhorting soldiers to hold firm, to fight with courage and honor, and to remember that the Republic's ideals were worth defending even if the cost was their lives. Cassius, witnessing the slow disintegration of the army, felt a growing sense of futility. Units were isolated, lines broken, and morale shattered, leaving him to grapple with the inevitable collapse of their carefully constructed defenses. By midday, the pressure from Antony and Octavian had achieved a decisive advantage. Encirclements cut off avenues of retreat, reserves were committed to futile counterattacks, and the Eastern legions were systematically overwhelmed. Soldiers, exhausted and fearful, questioned the worth of continued resistance, and the sense of doom pervaded the ranks. Brutus, though aware of the hopelessness of the situation, continued to lead by example, hoping to preserve a measure of dignity and honor in the face of overwhelming odds. Cassius, increasingly aware that further resistance would only prolong suffering, began contemplating the ultimate assertion of agency, choosing death on his own terms to retain a sense of control and preserve personal and familial honor. The battlefield, once a theater of strategic maneuver and disciplined engagement, had descended into chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought with desperation, while others fled or surrendered, the remaining cohesion fragile and tenuous. Antony and Octavian's forces pressed relentlessly, ensuring that no consolidation or regrouping could occur. As the late afternoon wore on, the inevitability of the Eastern legion's defeat became undeniable. Brutus and Cassius gathered the remaining officers, discussing the options for a final stand, a tactical retreat, or the deliberate choice of death, each weighing the preservation of honor against the certainty of capture or annihilation. The soldiers, exhausted, bloodied, and demoralized, looked to their leaders for guidance, relying on Brutus and Cassius to determine the final course of action. Brutus, embodying stoic resilience, prepared for a decisive engagement that would allow his men to fight with dignity and courage, even if the outcome was death. Cassius, consumed by despair but resolute, resolved to act in a way that would preserve personal honor and retain agency over the final moments of his life. Nightfall brought a tense, uneasy calm over the battlefield. Antony and Octavian maintained their vigilance, ensuring that the remaining forces of the conspirators could not regroup or escape. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the dawn would bring the final confrontation, took stock of their remaining troops, reflecting on the events that had led to this point, the assassination of Julius Caesar, the idealism that had motivated their actions, and the unforeseen consequences that had unleashed months of civil war, political upheaval, and personal anguish. Every thought carried the weight of history, for the coming hours would determine not only their survival but the fate of the Republic, the triumph of Caesar's legacy, and the memory of the ideals that had inspired their rebellion. As the night deepened, the stage was set for the ultimate resolution of a conflict born of ambition, betrayal, and political idealism, a resolution that would forever change the course of Rome, seal the fate of Brutus and Cassius, and cement the consequences of Caesar's assassination in the annals of history. The first light of dawn spilled across the battlefield, casting long shadows over the battered and weary remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces, and with it came the grim awareness that this day would determine the ultimate fate of the conspirators and the ideals they had fought to defend. Weeks of retreat, skirmishes, and relentless pursuit by Mark Antony and Octavian had left the Eastern legions fractured, exhausted, and deeply demoralized. Brutus, embodying calm and measured resolve, moved among his remaining soldiers, invoking Stoic philosophy to strengthen their courage, reminding them that their struggle had been motivated by principle and the defense of the Republic, and urging them to maintain dignity and honor in the face of overwhelming odds. Soldiers, though shaken, drew strength from his presence, yet even the bravest among them could not entirely suppress the anxiety that gripped the ranks. Cassius, consumed with despair, sought to rally scattered units, issue tactical orders, and hold together what remained of their formations, but the futility of the task weighed heavily upon him. The advance of Antony and Octavian was methodical and relentless. Antony, seasoned in command, exploited every opportunity to disrupt the conspirators' lines with feints, cavalry charges, and coordinated infantry assaults, while Octavian, astute and calculating, orchestrated flanking maneuvers and maintained cohesion among his forces, ensuring that the Eastern legions could find no sanctuary or advantage. As the battle erupted in the morning light, the clash of weapons, the thunder of hooves, and the cries of the wounded filled the air, and the Eastern legions, despite pockets of bravery, were gradually overwhelmed. Brutus moved continually among the troops, exhorting them to fight with courage and honor, emphasizing that their actions, even in defeat, would resonate through history, preserving the dignity of their cause. Cassius, observing the unraveling of their forces, felt despair deepen as formations broke, isolated groups of soldiers surrendered or fled, and the coordinated defense he had hoped to sustain crumbled under unrelenting pressure. By midday, Antony and Octavian had established a decisive advantage. Encirclements cut off retreat routes, reserves were committed to futile counterattacks, and the Eastern legions were systematically dismantled. The psychological weight on the soldiers was immense, as fear, exhaustion, and hopelessness spread through the ranks. Brutus, though fully aware of the dire circumstances, continued to embody stoic courage, preparing his men to fight to the end with dignity, while Cassius, increasingly convinced that further resistance was futile, contemplated the ultimate assertion of agency, taking his own life to preserve personal honor and control over his fate. The battlefield descended into chaos. Small units fought desperately while others scattered or surrendered, leaving Antony and Octavian's disciplined forces to exploit every weakness. The late afternoon brought grim certainty. The eastern legions were shattered, their strength decimated, and the opportunity to regroup or mount a meaningful counterattack had vanished. In scattered encampments, officers debated options: fight to the last, attempt retreat, or embrace death, but the remaining soldiers looked to Brutus and Cassius for direction, aware that their leaders' choices would determine the course of the day. Brutus, resolute, prepared for a final engagement that would allow his men to demonstrate courage and honor, even in the face of inevitable defeat. Cassius, though overwhelmed by despair, resolved to act decisively, ensuring that his final moments would reflect agency, principle, and the dignity he sought to preserve despite the collapse of their cause. As night fell, the battlefield was enveloped in tense silence, broken only by the cautious movements of Antony and Octavian's forces, who maintained vigilance to prevent any consolidation or escape by the remaining conspirators. Brutus and Cassius, acutely aware that the dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, consolidated what remained of their troops, reflecting on the path that had led them here: Caesar's assassination, the idealism that had motivated them, and the unforeseen consequences that had unleashed civil war, political upheaval, and personal anguish. Every thought carried the weight of history, for the events of the coming hours would determine not only who would survive, but whether the Roman Republic could endure, and how Julius Caesar's assassination would be remembered through the ages. The stage was set for the final resolution of a civil war born of ambition, betrayal, and political idealism, a resolution that would forever alter Rome, seal the fate of Brutus and Cassius, and ensure that the consequences of Caesar's murder would reverberate throughout history. In those tense, shadowed hours before the final battle, the forces of vengeance, ambition, ideology, and honor converged, each moment bringing the inexorable approach of destiny, shaping the ultimate transformation of Rome from a republic teetering on the brink to an empire defined by the consequences of a single, fateful act on the Ides of March. The morning of the decisive day arrived with a chilling quiet over the plains, the pale sunlight revealing the battered remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces, and with it came the grim knowledge that the hours ahead would determine not only the survival of the conspirators but the legacy of the ideals that had driven them to assassinate Julius Caesar. Weeks of retreat, attrition, and relentless pursuit by Mark Antony and Octavian had left the eastern legions fractured, exhausted, and demoralized. Brutus, though weary, moved among his soldiers with composed authority, invoking stoic principles to inspire courage, reminding them that they fought not for personal glory but for the preservation of the Republic, and urging them to maintain dignity even in the face of inevitable defeat. Soldiers listened, drawing strength from his presence, yet the weight of fear and exhaustion was evident in every hesitant glance and faltering step. Cassius, consumed by despair, attempted to marshal scattered units, issue tactical orders, and sustain some measure of cohesion, but the relentless advance of Antony and Octavian left little room for maneuver, and the psychological strain on both men and troops was crushing. Antony, seasoned by countless campaigns, exploited every weakness with precision. Feints, cavalry charges, and coordinated infantry assaults kept the conspirators off balance, while Octavian's strategic acumen ensured that no flank could be neglected, every opportunity to encircle, disrupt, or overwhelm the eastern forces seized with ruthless efficiency. As the armies clashed in the morning light, the battlefield erupted into chaos. The clash of swords, the pounding of hooves, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the plains. Brutus moved continually among his men, exhorting them to fight with courage and honor, reminding them that even in defeat, their actions would echo through history as testimony to their loyalty to principle and the ideals of liberty. Cassius, observing the disintegration of formations and the steady erosion of morale, felt despair deepen as units were surrounded, cut off, or surrendered, leaving him to confront the inevitability of the approaching end. By midday, Antony and Octavian's forces had achieved a decisive advantage. The eastern legions were isolated, supplies severed, reserves committed to hopeless counterattacks, and the cohesion of the army largely gone. Soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, faced the stark reality of annihilation, while Brutus and Cassius grappled with impossible choices: continue fighting in scattered engagements, attempt a perilous retreat, or embrace death on their own terms to preserve honor and agency. The battlefield, once a stage for calculated strategy and disciplined maneuvering, had descended into desperate chaos. Small bands of conspirators fought valiantly, yet others fled or surrendered, and Antony and Octavian exploited every lapse, ensuring that the eastern legions could not regroup. The late afternoon brought grim certainty: the army of Brutus and Cassius was shattered, and the final hour approached. In the remaining encampments, officers debated whether to make a last stand, attempt a retreat, or commit acts of deliberate self-destruction. Soldiers, weary and bloodied, looked to Brutus and Cassius for direction, understanding that their leaders' decisions would define the course of the day. Brutus, steadfast, prepared to lead his remaining forces in a final engagement, emphasizing courage, discipline, and the preservation of honor even in the face of inevitable death. Cassius, overwhelmed but resolute, accepted the certainty of his fate and resolved to act in a manner that would preserve dignity, agency, and the principles that had guided him, choosing death on his own terms over the humiliation of capture. As night fell, a tense calm enveloped the battlefield. Antony and Octavian maintained strict vigilance, ensuring that the remaining conspirators could neither regroup nor escape. Brutus and Cassius, acutely aware that the dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, gathered what remained of their forces, reflecting on the path that had led them here: Caesar's assassination, the idealism that had inspired their actions, and the unforeseen consequences that had unleashed civil war, political upheaval, and personal anguish. Each thought carried the weight of history, for the outcome of the coming hours would determine not only who would survive but the future of the Republic and how Julius Caesar's murder would be remembered. The stage was now set for the final resolution of a conflict born of ambition, betrayal, and political idealism, a resolution that would forever transform Rome, seal the fate of Brutus and Cassius, and ensure that the repercussions of Caesar's death reverberated throughout the annals of history. In the shadow of that approaching dawn, the forces of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, each moment drawing the conspirators inexorably toward their historic and tragic conclusion, a conclusion that would mark the end of a chapter in the Republic and the beginning of a new era shaped by the consequences of one fateful assassination on the Ides of March. The first light of the 22nd day over the battlefield revealed a landscape scarred by the remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's shattered forces, their soldiers weary, demoralized, and painfully aware that the hours ahead would decide not only their own fates but the legacy of the Republic itself. Brutus, embodying calm stoicism, moved among the men, urging them to hold fast to their principles and reminding them that honor and courage could endure even in the face of certain defeat. He spoke of the Republic's ideals, the responsibility they bore in defending them, and the notion that history might judge their intentions with fairness, if not the outcome. Soldiers, though exhausted and fearful, drew strength from his presence, their eyes flicking between the general and the advancing forces of Mark Antony and Octavian, whose disciplined formations and coordinated movements reflected the unyielding momentum of history itself. Cassius, consumed with despair yet unwilling to abandon control, attempted to marshal what remained of the eastern legions, issuing orders to patch gaps, rally scattered units, and maintain a semblance of cohesion. But each attempt was met with the harsh reality of exhaustion, disarray, and the relentless advance of Antony and Octavian, who exploited every weakness with precision and ruthless calculation. The morning erupted into violence as skirmishes escalated into full engagement. The clash of swords, the shouts of soldiers, and the thundering of hooves created a cacophony of chaos, while Brutus moved tirelessly through the lines, exhorting his men to fight with courage, discipline, and dignity, reminding them that even in defeat, their steadfastness could resonate through history. Cassius, witnessing the collapse of formations and the scattering of troops, felt despair deepen with every fallen comrade, every surrendered unit, and every failed counterattack, recognizing that the opportunity for meaningful resistance was rapidly disappearing. By midday, Antony and Octavian had established an overwhelming advantage. Their forces, coordinated and disciplined, encircled remaining units, severed communication, and exploited every lapse in the Eastern Legion's defense. Soldiers, exhausted and fearful, struggled to maintain cohesion, while officers debated impossible choices: fight to the last man, attempt a desperate retreat, or embrace death in a final act of agency and honor. The battlefield, once a theater of strategy and order, had descended into desperate chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought valiantly, yet others fled or surrendered, leaving Antony and Octavian's forces to exploit every weakness and ensure no opportunity for the Eastern legions to recover. Late afternoon brought grim clarity. The army of Brutus and Cassius was effectively shattered, its remnants scattered, and the inevitability of their defeat apparent to all. In the few remaining encampments, officers gathered to discuss a final course of action. Brutus, resolute and calm, prepared to lead his remaining men in a last engagement that would allow them to fight with honor and courage, preserving dignity even as the outcome of battle had been determined. Cassius, though tormented by despair, resolved to act decisively, taking his fate into his own hands, choosing death on his own terms rather than falling into the hands of the triumvirs, thus preserving a measure of personal honor and control. As evening descended, the battlefield fell into tense, uneasy silence. Antony and Octavian maintained vigilance, positioning their troops to prevent any regrouping or escape by the remaining conspirators, their awareness of the stakes as sharp as the blades they wielded. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the dawn would bring the final, decisive confrontation, gathered what remained of their forces, reflecting on the events that had brought them to this moment: the assassination of Julius Caesar, the ideals that had compelled them to act, and the unforeseen consequences that had spiraled into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Each thought carried the weight of history, for the decisions and actions of the coming hours would determine not only survival but the fate of the Roman Republic, the memory of Caesar's death, and the legacy of the conspirators' struggle for liberty. The stage was now set for the ultimate resolution, a climax born of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable currents of history that had been unleashed on the Ides of March. In the shadows of the approaching dawn, the forces of vengeance, ideology, courage, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius toward their final acts, shaping the irrevocable transformation of Rome from a republic in crisis to an empire forged in the consequences of one fateful assassination, ensuring that the echoes of their actions would reverberate through the ages, immortalized in history as the tragic, heroic, and inevitable conclusion of their rebellion. The first light of the 23rd day crept over the battlefield, illuminating the ragged remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces, each soldier weighed down by exhaustion, fear, and the knowledge that the hours ahead would determine not only their personal fates but the legacy of the ideals for which they had fought. Brutus, ever composed, moved among the troops, invoking Stoic philosophy to strengthen resolve, reminding them that the preservation of honor, courage, and principle mattered as much as victory itself, and that history might judge their intentions more kindly than the outcome of battle. His presence offered a fleeting sense of reassurance, yet even the most steadfast soldiers could not conceal the tension and dread etched into their faces. Cassius, in contrast, struggled to maintain order, issuing commands to rally scattered units, patch gaps, and delay the inevitable, but the relentless advance of Mark Antony and Octavian left little room for maneuver, and the psychological strain was evident in every motion, every hesitation, every faltering line. Antony, seasoned by countless campaigns and familiar with the intricacies of Roman warfare, exploited every weakness with precision: cavalry charges, feints, and coordinated infantry assaults destabilized the eastern formations, while Octavian, young but cunning, orchestrated flanking movements, maintained cohesion among his forces, and anticipated Brutus and Cassius's maneuvers, ensuring that every tactical opportunity was seized. As the battle erupted under the morning sun, the sounds of swords striking shields, the cries of the wounded, and the pounding of hooves created a maelstrom of chaos. The eastern legions, though still displaying pockets of bravery, were steadily overwhelmed by the superior discipline, coordination, and morale of Antony and Octavian's forces. Brutus, riding among his men, exhorted them to hold firm, to fight with honor, and to remember that courage in the face of impossible odds could immortalize them even in defeat. Cassius, observing the gradual disintegration of the army, felt despair deepen with each faltering line, each isolated unit cut off, and each failed counterattack, recognizing that continued resistance was rapidly losing all hope of success. By midday, Antony and Octavian had established a decisive advantage. Encirclements cut off escape routes, reserves committed to desperate counterattacks were swiftly neutralized, and the remnants of the eastern legions were fragmented and demoralized. Soldiers, exhausted and fearful, questioned whether further resistance was worth the inevitable loss of life, while Brutus and Cassius wrestled with impossible choices: to fight to the last man, to attempt a risky retreat, or to embrace death in a deliberate assertion of agency and honor. The battlefield, once a theater of strategy and order, descended into chaotic desperation. Small pockets of conspirators fought valiantly, but many scattered or surrendered, leaving Antony and Octavian to exploit every weakness and ensure that no recovery or regrouping could occur. Late afternoon brought grim clarity. The eastern legions were shattered, their strength all but extinguished, and the final confrontation inevitable. In scattered encampments, officers debated the best course of action: fight to the last, attempt escape, or commit deliberate self-destruction, while soldiers, weary, bloodied, and demoralized, looked to Brutus and Cassius for guidance, knowing that their leaders' decisions would shape the outcome of the day. Brutus, resolute and composed, prepared to lead a final engagement that would allow his men to demonstrate courage and maintain honor, even in the face of inevitable death. Cassius, overwhelmed but determined, resolved to act decisively, taking his fate into his own hands to preserve dignity, personal agency, and the ideals that had guided him, choosing death over capture or humiliation. As evening fell, the battlefield settled into tense, uneasy silence. Antony and Octavian maintained strict vigilance, ensuring the remaining conspirators could neither regroup nor escape, their forces prepared to deliver the final, decisive blow at first light. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the dawn would bring the climax of the conflict, gathered what remained of their troops, reflecting on the path that had brought them here: the assassination of Julius Caesar, the idealism and ambition that had driven them, and the unforeseen consequences that had plunged Rome into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Every thought carried the weight of history, for the coming hours would determine not only who survived, but the future of the Republic, the memory of Caesar's death, and the enduring legacy of the conspirators' struggle. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution, a culmination of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable forces unleashed by one fateful act on the Ides of March. In the shadowed hours before the final confrontation, the currents of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius inexorably toward their historic, tragic, and irreversible conclusion, a conclusion that would transform Rome forever and echo through the annals of history as the decisive end of their rebellion and the irrevocable consequence of Julius Caesar's assassination. The dawn of the 24th day broke over the bloodied plains, casting a pale, almost ghostly light upon the shattered remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces, each soldier carrying the weight of exhaustion, fear, and the knowledge that the hours ahead would determine the ultimate fate of their lives, their cause, and the ideals that had compelled them to assassinate Julius Caesar. Brutus, maintaining an air of composed stoicism, moved among the remaining troops, invoking the principles of Stoic philosophy to fortify courage and remind them that honor, integrity, and loyalty to principle were worth as much as the fleeting victory of battle. He spoke of the Republic, the responsibility they bore to defend its ideals, and the notion that even in defeat, their courage could resonate through history, preserving the dignity of their struggle. Soldiers, though fatigued and anxious, drew what strength they could from his presence, their eyes flicking toward the disciplined and advancing ranks of Mark Antony and Octavian, whose cohesion, strategic precision, and relentless momentum underscored the inevitability of the confrontation to come. Cassius, by contrast, wrestled with despair, moving among scattered units to issue orders, rally soldiers, and shore up faltering lines, yet the relentless advance of their opponents left little room for meaningful maneuver, and the psychological strain on both leader and troops was crushing. Antony, seasoned in war and adept at exploiting weakness, launched feints, cavalry charges, and coordinated infantry assaults that destabilized the eastern formations, while Octavian, young but shrewd, directed flanking movements, maintained internal cohesion among his forces, and anticipated Brutus and Cassius's countermeasures, ensuring that every tactical opportunity was seized to further the inexorable collapse of the eastern legions. As morning progressed, the battlefield erupted in chaos, the clash of swords, the shouts of combatants, the thundering of hooves, and the anguished cries of the wounded filled the air. The eastern legions, though still exhibiting pockets of courage and discipline, were steadily worn down by the superior coordination, morale, and numbers of Antony and Octavian's troops. Brutus rode among the ranks, exhorting soldiers to fight with courage, to maintain discipline, and to understand that even in inevitable defeat, their steadfastness would echo in the memory of history. Cassius, observing the unraveling of his forces, felt despair intensify as isolated units were cut off, lines collapsed, and counterattacks failed, leaving him to confront the reality that meaningful resistance was rapidly slipping beyond reach. By midday, Antony and Octavian had achieved overwhelming advantage. Encirclements severed retreat routes, reserves were committed to feudal engagements, and the eastern legions were fragmented, demoralized, and effectively neutralized. Soldiers, exhausted and terrified, questioned the value of continued resistance, while Brutus and Cassius weighed impossible options: fight to the last, attempt a perilous retreat, or embrace death to preserve agency, dignity, and honor. The battlefield had descended from disciplined engagement into desperate chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought valiantly, yet others scattered, surrendered, or were cut down, leaving Antony and Octavian free to exploit every weakness, ensuring that no opportunity for regrouping or recovery remained. Late afternoon brought grim certainty. The eastern legions were shattered, their strength diminished beyond repair, and the final hour approached. In scattered encampments, officers debated the best course of action, while soldiers, bloodied and weary, looked to Brutus and Cassius for direction, aware that their leaders' decisions would shape the final moments of the day. Brutus, steadfast in resolve, prepared to lead a final engagement that would allow his men to demonstrate courage, discipline, and honor even in the face of certain death. Cassius, though consumed by despair, resolved to act decisively, asserting control over his fate through deliberate action, choosing death over capture, humiliation, or the loss of personal agency. As evening settled, the battlefield fell into tense, uneasy silence, punctuated only by the cautious movements of Antony and Octavian's vigilant forces, poised to deliver the final, decisive blow. Brutus and Cassius, acutely aware that the dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, gathered the remaining troops, reflecting on the path that had brought them to this moment: the assassination of Caesar, the ideals that inspired their rebellion, and the cascading consequences that had led Rome into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Every thought carried the weight of history, for the coming hours would determine not only survival but the future of the Republic, the memory of Caesar's death, and the enduring legacy of the conspirators' struggle. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution, a culmination of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable forces unleashed by one fateful act on the Ides of March. In the shadow of approaching dawn, the currents of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius inexorably toward their historic, tragic, and irreversible conclusion, shaping the irrevocable transformation of Rome from a republic teetering on the brink to an empire forged by the consequences of Caesar's assassination, ensuring that the echoes of their actions would reverberate through the annals of history as the final, fateful act of rebellion that would define their lives and Rome's destiny forever. The dawn of the 25th day rose over the blood-stained plains with a muted, somber light, revealing the tattered remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's exhausted forces, each soldier aware that the hours ahead would determine not only the outcome of their struggle but the enduring legacy of the ideals for which they had risked life and honor. Brutus, steadfast and composed, moved among his men, invoking the philosophy of Stoicism to strengthen resolve, reminding them that courage, honor, and adherence to principle were as vital as victory itself, and that history might remember their intentions more kindly than the outcome of the battle. Soldiers, though weary and apprehensive, drew what courage they could from his presence, their eyes scanning the advancing lines of Mark Antony and Octavian, whose disciplined, coordinated, and unrelenting approach underscored the inevitability of confrontation. Cassius, consumed by despair yet unwilling to relinquish control, moved among the scattered units, issuing orders to rally troops, reinforce faltering lines, and execute last-ditch maneuvers, though the relentless pressure of their opponents allowed little room for meaningful action. Antony, seasoned by years of warfare and skilled in exploiting weakness, deployed feints, cavalry charges, and coordinated infantry assaults to destabilize the eastern formations, while Octavian, astute and calculating, directed flanking operations, maintained cohesion among his forces, and anticipated the conspirators' tactical responses, ensuring that every opportunity to further erode Brutus and Cassius's army was exploited with ruthless efficiency. As the morning unfolded, the battlefield erupted into chaos. The clash of steel, the pounding of hooves, and the anguished cries of the wounded filled the air, while small pockets of the eastern legions fought with courage, attempting to resist the relentless advance. Brutus moved tirelessly among the men, exhorting them to hold the line, to fight with honor, and to recognize that even in inevitable defeat, their courage would echo through history. Cassius, witnessing the unraveling of formations and the scattering of troops, felt despair intensify. Isolated units were cut off, counterattacks failed, and the reality of impending defeat settled heavily upon him. By midday, Antony and Octavian's forces had established an overwhelming advantage. Encirclements severed any avenues of retreat, reserves committed to desperate counterattacks were swiftly neutralized, and the remnants of the eastern legions were fragmented, demoralized, and nearly incapable of coordinated resistance. Soldiers, bloodied, exhausted, and terrified, questioned whether further resistance was meaningful, while Brutus and Cassius faced impossible choices: continue fighting in scattered engagements, attempt a desperate retreat, or embrace death to preserve agency, dignity, and honor. The battlefield had descended from a theater of strategy to one of desperate chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought with valor, but many fled, surrendered, or were cut down, leaving Antony and Octavian free to exploit every weakness and ensure no recovery or regrouping could occur. Late afternoon brought grim clarity. The eastern legions were effectively destroyed, their strength nearly extinguished, and the final confrontation imminent. In the few remaining encampments, officers debated the final course of action, while soldiers looked to Brutus and Cassius for guidance, aware that their leaders' choices would determine the last acts of the day. Brutus, resolute, prepared to lead a final engagement that would allow his men to demonstrate courage, discipline, and honor even in the face of inevitable death. Cassius, though consumed by despair, resolved to act decisively, choosing death on his own terms over capture, humiliation, or the loss of agency, preserving personal honor and the principles that had guided him. As evening fell, the battlefield settled into tense, uneasy silence, punctuated only by the cautious movements of Antony and Octavian's vigilant forces, poised to deliver the decisive blow at first light. Brutus and Cassius, acutely aware that the dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, gathered the remaining troops, reflecting on the path that had brought them here, Caesar's assassination, the ideals and ambitions that had driven them, and the cascading consequences that had plunged Rome into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Every thought carried the weight of history, for the coming hours would determine not only survival but the future of the Republic, the memory of Caesar's death, and the enduring legacy of the conspirators' struggle. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution, the culmination of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable consequences of one fateful act on the Ides of March. In the shadow of approaching dawn, the currents of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius inexorably toward their historic, tragic, and irreversible conclusion, ensuring that the transformation of Rome from a republic in crisis to an empire forged by consequence would be forever sealed in the annals of history, immortalizing the final, fateful acts of rebellion and the tragic heroism of those who dared defy the tide of history itself. The dawn of the 26th day cast a pale, hesitant light across the devastated plains, revealing the tattered and exhausted remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces, each man burdened with fatigue, fear, and the crushing awareness that the coming hours would determine not only their personal fates but the legacy of the principles for which they had risked everything. Brutus, maintaining his stoic composure, moved among the remaining troops, invoking philosophy and the ideals of the Republic to fortify resolve, reminding them that courage, honor, and steadfastness in principle mattered as much as victory itself and that the record of history might remember their intentions more kindly than the outcome of battle. The soldiers, though bloodied, weary, and shaken, drew strength from his presence, their gaze shifting between him and the advancing formations of Mark Antony and Octavian, whose disciplined movements, strategic coordination, and relentless advance underscored the inevitability of the confrontation to come. Cassius, consumed by despair yet determined not to relinquish control, moved among the scattered units, issuing orders, rallying soldiers, and attempting to patch gaps in the line, though every maneuver was met with the unyielding pressure of Antony and Octavian, leaving little room for meaningful counteraction. Antony, experienced in the art of war, exploited every weakness with precision, launching cavalry charges, feints, and coordinated infantry assaults that destabilized the already fragile eastern formations, while Octavian, calculating and shrewd, orchestrated flanking operations, maintained cohesion among his troops, and anticipated the conspirators' maneuvers, ensuring that every opportunity to erode Brutus and Cassius's forces was seized with ruthless efficiency. By mid-morning, the battlefield had erupted into a maelstrom of chaos. The clash of swords, the cries of the wounded, the pounding of hooves, and the acrid scent of smoke and dust filled the air. The eastern legions, though still displaying pockets of bravery, were steadily overwhelmed by the superior coordination, morale, and numbers of Antony and Octavian's forces. Brutus rode tirelessly among the ranks, exhorting the men to fight with courage, to maintain discipline, and to remember that even in inevitable defeat, their steadfastness would resonate in the annals of history. Cassius, watching the gradual collapse of his army, felt despair deepen as isolated units were cut off, lines broke, and counterattacks failed, leaving him to confront the inexorable reality that meaningful resistance was rapidly disappearing. By midday, Antony and Octavian's forces had secured a decisive advantage. Encirclements cut off retreat, reserves committed to desperate counterattacks were swiftly neutralized, and the remaining eastern troops were fragmented and demoralized. Soldiers, exhausted, bloodied, and fearful, questioned the value of continued resistance, while Brutus and Cassius faced impossible choices: to fight on in scattered engagements, attempt a perilous retreat, or embrace death in order to preserve agency, dignity, and honor. The battlefield, once a theater of strategic engagement, had descended into desperate chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought valiantly, but many fled, surrendered, or were cut down, leaving Antony and Octavian free to exploit every weakness and prevent any recovery. As afternoon waned, the grim certainty settled over Brutus and Cassius. the eastern legions were shattered, their strength almost extinguished, and the final confrontation was inevitable. In scattered encampments, officers debated the final course of action, while soldiers, weary and bloodied, looked to Brutus and Cassius for direction, knowing that their leaders' decisions would shape the last acts of the day. Brutus, resolute and calm, prepared to lead a final engagement, aiming to allow his men to demonstrate courage, discipline, and honor, even in the face of certain death. Cassius, though tormented by despair, resolved to act decisively, asserting control over his fate, choosing death over capture, humiliation, or the loss of personal agency, thereby preserving dignity and the principles that had guided him. As night fell, the battlefield became tense and eerily still, broken only by the cautious movements of Antony and Octavian's vigilant forces, poised to deliver the final, decisive blow at first light. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the coming dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, gathered their remaining troops, reflecting on the path that had led them here, the assassination of Julius Caesar, the ideals that inspired their rebellion, and the cascading consequences that had drawn Rome into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Each thought carried the weight of history, for the hours to come would determine not only who survived but also the fate of the Republic, the memory of Caesar's death, and the enduring legacy of the conspirators' struggle. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution, the culmination of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable forces unleashed by one fateful act on the Ides of March. In the shadowed hours before the final confrontation, the currents of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius inexorably toward their historic, tragic, and irreversible conclusion, shaping the transformation of Rome from a republic teetering on the brink into an empire forged by consequence, ensuring that the echoes of their actions would resound through history as the final, fateful act of rebellion that defined both their lives and Rome's destiny forever. The first light of the 27th day spread cautiously over the battlefield, illuminating the battered remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces, each soldier weary, bloodied, and painfully aware that the coming hours would seal their fate, determine the survival of their ideals, and define the legacy of the rebellion that had begun with the assassination of Julius Caesar. Brutus, calm yet resolute, moved among the remaining troops, invoking Stoic philosophy and the principles of honor and courage to bolster morale, reminding them that though victory might elude them, their adherence to principle and valor in the face of overwhelming odds could resonate through history, preserving the dignity of their cause. Soldiers, though trembling from exhaustion and fear, drew a measure of strength from his presence, their eyes darting toward the advancing, disciplined lines of Mark Antony and Octavian, whose calculated advance, coordination, and relentless pressure left no room for hesitation or misstep. Cassius, consumed by despair but unwilling to surrender control of his destiny, moved among scattered units, issuing orders, rallying soldiers, and attempting to patch faltering lines, yet the constant and unyielding pressure from Antony and Octavian allowed little opportunity for meaningful counteraction, and the strain on both leader and troops was palpable. Antony, experienced and cunning, exploited every weakness with precision. Feints, cavalry charges, and synchronized infantry assaults disoriented the already fragile eastern formations, while Octavian, astute and unflinching, orchestrated flanking movements, ensured cohesion among his troops, and anticipated the conspirators' tactical decisions, leaving Brutus and Cassius little room to maneuver and steadily eroding the cohesion and morale of their forces. As the morning unfolded, the battlefield erupted in chaos, the clash of swords and shields, the pounding of hooves, and the anguished cries of the wounded created a thunderous, unrelenting maelstrom. The eastern legions, though exhibiting occasional pockets of courage, were steadily overwhelmed by Antony and Octavian's superior coordination, discipline, and numbers. Brutus moved tirelessly among the ranks, exhorting soldiers to hold firm, to fight with honor, and to understand that even in inevitable defeat, their courage would echo through history, immortalizing their steadfastness. Cassius, watching the gradual collapse of his army, felt despair deepen as isolated units were cut off, lines broke, and desperate counterattacks failed, forcing him to confront the inexorable reality that meaningful resistance was slipping beyond reach. By midday, Antony and Octavian had achieved overwhelming advantage. Encirclements severed retreat routes, reserves committed to desperate counterattacks were swiftly neutralized, and the remaining eastern legions were fragmented, demoralized, and nearly incapable of coordinated action. Soldiers, bloodied and terrified, questioned the purpose of further resistance, while Brutus and Cassius faced impossible choices: to fight in scattered engagements, attempt a perilous retreat, or embrace death in order to preserve agency, honor, and dignity. The battlefield had descended from disciplined engagement into desperate chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought valiantly, but many fled, surrendered, or were cut down, leaving Antony and Octavian free to exploit every weakness and ensure no recovery or regrouping could occur. Late afternoon brought grim certainty. The eastern legions were shattered, their strength nearly extinguished, and the final confrontation was unavoidable. In scattered encampments, officers debated the final course of action, while soldiers, weary, bloodied, and demoralized, looked to Brutus and Cassius for guidance, aware that their leaders' decisions would determine the last acts of the day. Brutus, resolute and calm, prepared to lead a final engagement, allowing his men to demonstrate courage, discipline, and honor, even as the outcome of the battle had been determined. Cassius, though overwhelmed by despair, resolved to act decisively, asserting control over his fate, choosing death on his own terms rather than falling into the hands of the triumvirs, thereby preserving dignity and the principles that had guided him. As night fell, the battlefield descended into tense, uneasy silence, broken only by the cautious movements of Antony and Octavian's vigilant forces, poised to deliver the decisive blow at first light. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, gathered their remaining troops, reflecting on the path that had brought them to this moment: the assassination of Caesar, the ideals that inspired their rebellion, and the cascading consequences that had plunged Rome into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Each thought carried the weight of history, for the hours to come would determine not only who survived but the future of the Republic, the memory of Caesar's death, and the enduring legacy of the conspirators' struggle. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution, the culmination of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable consequences of one fateful act on the Ides of March. In the shadowed hours before the final confrontation, the currents of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius inexorably toward their historic, tragic, and irreversible conclusion, ensuring that the transformation of Rome from a republic teetering on the brink into an empire forged by consequence would be forever sealed, immortalizing the final acts of rebellion and the tragic heroism of those who dared defy the tide of history itself. The dawn of the 28th day crept over the horizon, casting a pale and somber light across the battered plains where the remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's exhausted forces huddled, bloodied, and acutely aware that the hours ahead would determine not only the survival of their lives but the legacy of the ideals that had driven them to act against Julius Caesar. Brutus, composed and resolute, moved among his remaining soldiers, invoking the Stoic philosophy that had guided his decisions, emphasizing that courage, honor, and fidelity to principle could outlast even the certainty of defeat, and that the judgment of history might preserve their intentions if not their triumph. Soldiers, though trembling from fatigue and fear, drew what strength they could from his presence, their eyes constantly scanning the advancing lines of Mark Antony and Octavian, whose disciplined formations, precise coordination, and relentless advance underscored the inexorability of the confrontation. Cassius, consumed by despair yet unwilling to relinquish control of his fate, moved among scattered units, issuing orders to rally soldiers, reinforce failing lines, and exploit any momentary opportunity, though the unyielding pressure of Antony and Octavian left little room for maneuver, and every effort seemed to fall short against the tide of the enemy. Antony, experienced and cunning, exploited every weakness with precision, orchestrated cavalry charges, feints, and synchronized infantry assaults dismantled the fragile eastern formations, while Octavian, calculating and astute, directed flanking operations, maintained cohesion among his troops, and anticipated the conspirators' moves, ensuring that every opening was seized to further erode Brutus and Cassius's forces. By mid-morning, the battlefield had erupted into a violent cacophony, the clash of steel on steel, the pounding of hooves, the cries of the wounded, and the acrid haze of dust and blood created an almost unbearable din. The Eastern legions, though still demonstrating sporadic bravery, were steadily ground down by the superior numbers, morale, and coordination of Antony and Octavian's forces. Brutus moved tirelessly among his men, urging them to hold firm, fight with discipline, and understand that even in inevitable defeat, their courage and loyalty to principle would echo in the chronicles of history. Cassius, witnessing the collapse of formations and the scattering of soldiers, felt despair intensify, isolated units were cut off, desperate counterattacks failed, and the inevitability of the army's destruction became undeniable. By midday, Antony and Octavian had gained overwhelming advantage. Encirclements severed all avenues of retreat, reserves committed to last-ditch counterattacks were swiftly neutralized, and the remaining eastern forces were fragmented, demoralized, and nearly incapable of organized resistance. Soldiers, exhausted, bloodied, and fearful, questioned the purpose of continuing to fight, while Brutus and Cassius confronted impossible decisions: to persist in scattered engagements, attempt a perilous retreat, or embrace death to preserve agency, dignity, and honor. The battlefield, once a theater of strategy and order, had descended into desperate chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought with valor, but many fled, surrendered, or were cut down, leaving Antony and Octavian free to exploit every weakness, ensuring no opportunity for regrouping remained. As afternoon waned, grim clarity settled upon Brutus and Cassius. The eastern legions were shattered, their strength nearly extinguished, and the final confrontation was unavoidable. In scattered encampments, officers debated their course, while soldiers, weary, bloodied, and demoralized, looked to Brutus and Cassius for guidance, understanding that their leaders' choices would dictate the last acts of the day. Brutus, steadfast and calm, prepared to lead a final engagement, aiming to allow his men to demonstrate courage, discipline, and honor even in the face of certain death. Cassius, though overwhelmed by despair, resolved to act decisively, taking control of his own fate, choosing death over capture or humiliation, and preserving dignity along with the principles that had guided him throughout the rebellion. As night fell, the battlefield became shrouded in tense, uneasy silence, broken only by the cautious movements of Antony and Octavian's vigilant forces, ready to strike decisively at first light. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the coming dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, gathered their remaining troops, reflecting on the path that had brought them to this moment: Caesar's assassination, the ideals and ambitions that had driven their rebellion, and the cascading consequences that had plunged Rome into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Each thought bore the weight of history, for the hours ahead would determine not only survival but the Republic's future, the memory of Caesar's death, and the enduring legacy of the conspirators' struggle. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution, the culmination of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable forces unleashed by one fateful act on the Ides of March. In the shadowed hours before the final confrontation, the currents of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius inexorably toward their historic, tragic, and irreversible conclusion, shaping the transformation of Rome from a republic teetering on the brink into an empire forged by consequence, ensuring that the echoes of their actions would resonate through history as the final, fateful acts of rebellion and the tragic heroism of those who dared defy the tide of destiny itself. The 29th day dawned over the blood-soaked plains with a pale, trembling light that fell upon the exhausted remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's forces, each soldier acutely aware that the hours ahead would determine the ultimate fate of their lives. the survival of their cause, and the enduring memory of the ideals that had compelled them to act against Julius Caesar. Brutus, steadfast and calm, moved among the remaining men, invoking the Stoic principles that had long guided his life and leadership, emphasizing that courage, discipline, and fidelity to principle could outlast even the certainty of defeat, and that the judgment of history might remember their intentions more kindly than the outcome of the battle itself. The soldiers, though battered, weary, and fearful, drew what strength they could from his presence, their gaze flickering between him and the advancing lines of Mark Antony and Octavian, whose coordinated formations, strategic precision, and unrelenting pressure left no room for hesitation, misstep, or recovery. Cassius, consumed by despair but determined not to relinquish control, moved among the scattered units, issuing orders to rally troops, reinforce faltering lines, and seize any fleeting opportunity to slow the enemy, yet the overwhelming momentum of Antony and Octavian's forces made every effort seem insufficient, and the strain upon both leader and soldiers was almost unbearable. Antony, seasoned in warfare and adept at exploiting weaknesses, deployed cavalry charges, feints, and synchronized infantry attacks to dismantle the fragile eastern formations, while Octavian, astute and calculating, orchestrated flanking movements, maintained cohesion among his troops, and anticipated the conspirators' tactical responses, ensuring that every opening was seized to further erode the remnants of Brutus and Cassius's forces. By mid-morning, the battlefield erupted into chaos and violence. The clash of steel, the pounding of hooves, the cries of the wounded, and the acrid haze of blood and dust created an overwhelming maelstrom. The eastern legions, though still showing intermittent bravery, were steadily consumed by the superior numbers, discipline, and morale of Antony and Octavian's army. Brutus rode tirelessly among the troops, urging them to hold firm, fight with honor, and understand that even in inevitable defeat, their courage and loyalty to principle would resonate through the annals of history. Cassius, watching the disintegration of formations, isolated units being cut off, and desperate counterattacks failing, felt despair deepen, recognizing that meaningful resistance was slipping beyond reach and that the final hour approached. By midday, Antony and Octavian had secured overwhelming advantage. Encirclements severed escape routes, reserves committed to desperate maneuvers were neutralized, and the eastern forces were fragmented, demoralized, and nearly incapable of organized action. Soldiers, bloodied, exhausted, and terrified, questioned the purpose of continuing the fight, while Brutus and Cassius faced impossible choices: persist in scattered engagements, attempt a perilous retreat, or embrace death in order to preserve dignity, agency, and honor. The battlefield, once a theater of strategy, had descended into desperate chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought valiantly, yet many fled, surrendered, or were cut down, leaving Antony and Octavian free to exploit every weakness and ensure that no opportunity for regrouping remained. As afternoon waned, grim certainty settled upon Brutus and Cassius. Their forces were shattered, their strength nearly extinguished, and the final confrontation was unavoidable. In scattered encampments, officers debated the final course of action, while soldiers, weary, bloodied, and demoralized, looked to Brutus and Cassius for guidance, knowing that their leaders' decisions would shape the last acts of the day. Brutus, resolute and composed, prepared to lead a final engagement, allowing his men to demonstrate courage, discipline, and honor even in the face of certain death. Cassius, though tormented by despair, resolved to act decisively, taking control of his own fate, choosing death over capture or humiliation, thereby preserving dignity and the principles that had guided him throughout the rebellion. As night fell, the battlefield fell into tense, uneasy silence, broken only by the vigilant movements of Antony and Octavian's forces, poised to deliver the decisive blow at first light. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the coming dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, gathered the remaining troops, reflecting on the path that had led them here, the assassination of Caesar, the ideals that had inspired their rebellion, and the cascading consequences that had plunged Rome into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Every thought carried the weight of history, for the hours ahead would determine not only survival but the Republic's future, the memory of Caesar's death, and the enduring legacy of the conspirators' struggle. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution, the culmination of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable forces unleashed by one fateful act on the Ides of March. In the shadowed hours before the final confrontation, the currents of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius inexorably toward their historic, tragic, and irreversible conclusion, ensuring that the transformation of Rome from a republic teetering on the brink into an empire forged by consequence would be forever sealed, immortalizing the final, fateful acts of rebellion and the tragic heroism of those who dared defy the tide of destiny itself. The dawn of the 30th day broke over the shattered plains with a muted, almost spectral light, revealing the final remnants of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus's weary and bloodied forces, each soldier fully aware that the hours ahead would determine not only the fate of their lives but the legacy of the rebellion that had begun with the assassination of Julius Caesar, and the ideals of honor, liberty, and republican virtue that had guided them. Brutus, composed and resolute despite the overwhelming adversity, moved among the remaining troops, invoking the Stoic principles that had long shaped his character, emphasizing that courage, discipline, and steadfast adherence to principle could outlast the certainty of defeat, and that even if victory eluded them, the memory of their valor and fidelity to Rome's ideals would endure in history. Soldiers, exhausted, bloodied, and fearful, drew a measure of strength from his presence, their eyes flicking between him and the advancing, disciplined lines of Mark Antony and Octavian, whose calculated movements, relentless coordination, and unyielding momentum left no room for hesitation or miscalculation. Cassius, consumed by despair but unwilling to surrender control of his fate, moved among scattered units, issuing orders, rallying soldiers, and attempting to exploit fleeting opportunities, yet every maneuver was met with the inexorable pressure of Antony and Octavian, leaving little room for meaningful resistance and intensifying the strain upon both leader and men. Antony, seasoned by countless campaigns and skilled in exploiting weakness, orchestrated cavalry charges, feints, and synchronized infantry assaults that shattered the fragile eastern formations, while Octavian, young but shrewd and unrelenting, directed flanking movements, maintained cohesion among his troops, and anticipated the conspirators' tactical responses, ensuring that every lapse in discipline was exploited to further diminish Brutus and Cassius's forces. By mid-morning, the battlefield had erupted into an unrelenting chaos. The clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, the cries of the wounded, and the acrid haze of dust and blood created a relentless maelstrom that seemed to consume both men and hope alike. The eastern legions, though still showing sporadic bravery, were steadily ground down by the superior numbers, discipline, and morale of Antony and Octavian's forces. Brutus, riding tirelessly among the ranks, exhorted his soldiers to maintain courage, discipline, and a sense of honor, reminding them that even in inevitable defeat, their steadfastness would echo in the annals of history. Cassius, witnessing the disintegration of his army, isolated units being cut off, and desperate counterattacks failing, felt despair intensify, forced to confront the inexorable reality that meaningful resistance was slipping beyond reach and that the final confrontation approached with inexorable certainty. By midday, Antony and Octavian had achieved an overwhelming advantage. Encirclements severed all avenues of retreat, reserves committed to last-ditch counterattacks were neutralized, and the remaining eastern forces were fragmented, demoralized, and nearly incapable of organized action. Soldiers, bloodied, exhausted, and fearful, questioned whether continued resistance held any purpose, while Brutus and Cassius faced impossible decisions: to fight in scattered engagements, attempt a perilous retreat, or embrace death to preserve agency, honor, and dignity. The battlefield, once a theater of strategy, had descended into desperate chaos. Small groups of conspirators fought valiantly, but many fled, surrendered, or were cut down, leaving Antony and Octavian free to exploit every weakness and ensure no opportunity for recovery remained. As afternoon waned, grim certainty settled upon Brutus and Cassius. the eastern legions were shattered, their strength nearly extinguished, and the final confrontation was unavoidable. In scattered encampments, officers debated their last course, while soldiers, weary, bloodied, and demoralized, looked to Brutus and Cassius for guidance, understanding that their leaders' choices would dictate the final acts of the day. Brutus, resolute and composed, prepared to lead a final engagement, aiming to allow his men to demonstrate courage, discipline, and honor even in the face of inevitable death. Cassius, though tormented by despair, resolved to act decisively, taking control of his own fate, choosing death over capture, humiliation, or the loss of personal agency, thereby preserving dignity and the principles that had guided him throughout the rebellion. As night fell, the battlefield settled into tense, uneasy silence, broken only by the vigilant movements of Antony and Octavian's forces, poised to strike decisively at first light. Brutus and Cassius, aware that the coming dawn would bring the climactic confrontation, gathered their remaining troops, reflecting on the path that had brought them to this moment, Caesar's assassination, the ideals that had inspired their rebellion, and the cascading consequences that had plunged Rome into civil war, political upheaval, and personal tragedy. Every thought carried the weight of history, for the hours ahead would determine not only survival but the future of the Republic, the memory of Caesar's death, and the enduring legacy of the conspirators' struggle. The stage was set for the ultimate resolution, the culmination of ambition, betrayal, political idealism, and the inexorable consequences unleashed by one fateful act on the Ides of March. In the shadowed hours before the final confrontation, the currents of honor, vengeance, ideology, and destiny converged, drawing Brutus and Cassius inexorably toward their historic, tragic, and irreversible conclusion, ensuring that the transformation of Rome from a republic teetering on the brink into an empire forged by consequence would be forever sealed, immortalizing the final, fateful acts of rebellion and the tragic heroism of those who dared defy the tide of history itself, leaving an indelible mark upon the annals of time that would echo through generations as both warning and testament to the cost of ambition, idealism, and betrayal intertwined.